There is a question buried in the oldest surviving records of the Jedi Order. Not in the celebrated volumes, not in the war chronicles that fill the official histories, but in the margins, in correction marks, in the small, careful notations that archivists add when they are trying to reconcile one account with another and cannot. The question is this: how does a person become the thing they most despise? Not through one decision, not through a single catastrophic moment where everything changes and nothing can be undone. The records suggest something slower than that, something more patient, something that moved the way erosion moves, invisible year by year, irreversible in total. The man this investigation concerns was not born a Sith Lord. He was not born cruel or ambitious in the way cruelty requires. He was born on a world called Quayle, in a period the Old Republic archives place somewhere between 3994 and 3980 BBY, and he was given a name so extraordinary in its length and construction that almost everyone who knew him simply stopped using it. His surname, Squinquagesimus, appears in exactly 3 surviving documents from his early life. In all 3, a later hand has added the word squint in the margin, as if whoever came after him wanted future readers to understand that even then, even as a child, the full weight of what he carried had already been abbreviated by the people around him. That name, Squint, is where this investigation begins. Not with Darth Malak, not with the Sith Lord who would one day order the bombardment of Taris, a planet of 6 billion living people, from the safety of an orbiting warship. Not with the figure the galaxy came to fear. With a boy named Squint, on a Jedi transport, carrying a name no one could pronounce. The earliest confirmed records of Alex Squinquagesimus place him within the Jedi Order's training program during what historians call the Revanchist period, that complicated decade before the Mandalorian Wars, when the Order was, by most measures, at the height of its institutional confidence and the beginning of its deepest institutional failure. He arrived at training, as most Jedi children did, separated from family by the traditions of the Order, assessed for Force sensitivity, enrolled in a curriculum designed to shape that sensitivity towards service, discipline, and a particular kind of wisdom that emphasized patience above almost every other virtue. The patience part, the records suggest, did not take. What survives from those early years is fragmentary by necessity. The Dantooine Enclave, where significant portions of the Revanchist-era Jedi records were housed, was destroyed during the Jedi Civil War, deliberately. The destruction of that archive was not an act of war. It served no tactical function the surviving records can identify. Its destruction removed, among other things, most of what was documented about a young Padawan named Alec. Whether that is coincidence, the investigation cannot determine. What survives comes from other sources, peripheral records, references embedded in larger documents concerned with other subjects. A few testimonies gathered after the war by Republic historians trying to reconstruct what had happened. These fragments, assembled carefully, produce a portrait, incomplete, contested in some of its details, but coherent enough that the shape of the person is visible. Alec was, by multiple accounts, exceptionally strong in the Force. This was not unusual among Jedi Padawans. The Order selected for that quality deliberately, but the degree of his sensitivity appears to have been notable even within a group of notable individuals. The same accounts that record this strength also record something else, an intensity in how he processed what his sensitivity showed him. Where other Force-sensitive students might perceive a person's suffering as information to be categorized and responded to appropriately, Alec appears to have perceived it as something closer to an emergency. This distinction matters to the investigation. It is not the same thing as recklessness. It is not the same thing as anger, in the way the Jedi typically warned against anger. It is something more specific, a very low tolerance for the gap between what was happening to people and what was being done about it. The Jedi training program of that era was not well equipped to work with that particular quality. He met Revan during training. The records do not specify exactly when or where, another gap created by Dantooine's destruction. But multiple sources confirm that the friendship between them was established early and was, from the beginning, something that distinguished both of them within the Order. The relationship between Alec and the person history would call Darth Revan has been analyzed and reanalyzed in the decades since the Jedi Civil War, and one consistent observation runs through nearly every account. They were not alike. They were complementary in a way that was rarer and more dangerous than simple similarity. Revan, according to those who trained alongside them, was strategic, almost instinctively, capable of reading a situation at multiple levels simultaneously, of holding competing goals in tension, of patience when patience served a purpose. What he lacked, at least in those early years, was the urgency that made Alec impossible to ignore. Where Revan could assess a moral problem and determine the optimal response over time, Alec experienced the delay between assessment and response as something that cost lives. What this meant, in practice, was that Revan could think and Alec could feel, and that together they formed something more complete than either of them was alone. The Jedi Council, it is worth noting, was aware of this dynamic. The records that survive from Enclave correspondence in this period include at least 2 references to the pair as a unit, not as individuals. In discussions about their development, the Council saw the combination. The Council was, depending on which account one consults, either concerned about it or satisfied that it would balance itself out in time. The evidence does not indicate the Council was correct in that confidence. To understand what Alec was before the fall, it is necessary to understand what the Jedi Order was before the fall, and what it was becoming. The Order of that era occupied a specific institutional position in the Republic, deeply respected, broadly powerful, politically careful to the point of deliberate passivity. The Council's philosophy of non-intervention in what it designated political matters had served the Order well across centuries. It had preserved Jedi neutrality. It had prevented entanglements that might compromise the Order's credibility as a mediating force. It had, by any reasonable measure, worked. It had also, by the evidence of what was happening on the Republic's outer edges, failed. The Mandalorians had been moving through those edges for years, by the time Alec was a Padawan completing his training. Not raids, systematic occupation, absorption, the cultural and sometimes physical elimination of the populations they encountered. Worlds that had been Republic-aligned for generations were being restructured, and the people on those worlds were experiencing this restructuring not as political inconvenience, but as survival emergency. The Jedi Council's position, carefully maintained through multiple discussions and documented in the communications that survived Dantooine's destruction, only because copies existed elsewhere, was that direct Jedi intervention in what it characterized as a military conflict between external parties risked compromising the Order's role as a force for peace rather than a participant in war. The Republic Senate was debating the appropriate response. The Republic military was stretched. The Council was waiting. For a Padawan with a very low tolerance for the gap between what was happening and what was being done, this position was not wisdom. It was not even patience. It was something that the records suggest Alec found, with increasing difficulty, impossible to accept. There is a specific incident documented in the KOTOR comic records, one of the few surviving sources that preserves Alec in any detail during this period, that illustrates what the evidence elsewhere only implies. On the planet Taris, in the lower city sectors where the Republic's social structures had already stratified into something approaching a caste system, Alec encountered a population of people who were not being helped. Not by the Republic, not by the Jedi, not by any official body that might have been expected to notice them. They were enslaved, not metaphorically, not in the soft language that sometimes softens the word. Actually enslaved, bought, sold, worked, and regarded by the upper city's legal framework as a category of property rather than a category of person. Alec, as a Jedi, was in a position to observe this. The Order's doctrine, in situations of this kind, was to observe carefully, to assess whether intervention fell within the appropriate scope of Jedi authority, and to proceed through established Republic channels where direct action was not clearly warranted. He did not find this position sustainable. What he did instead, what the record suggests he attempted, what authority he invoked, what lines he crossed or did not cross in his response, is documented imperfectly. The accounts differ in specifics, but the pattern they all agree on is this. Alec saw people suffering under conditions that had official permission and institutional protection, and he could not stand at the appropriate distance and assess. He acted. The investigation does not need to determine whether his action was wise or unwise, sanctioned or unsanctioned, effective or counterproductive. What the investigation needs to understand is what it reveals about the person who took it, because that person, and that specific quality in that person, is the one the investigation is trying to trace forward to a place that seems impossible to reach from here. The man who could not tolerate the distance between suffering and response on Taris is the same man who would one day order turbo-laser strikes on Taris from orbit. The same planet, the same people, or people exactly like them, below. This is the distance the investigation is trying to measure. He was given the name Alec formally, departing from the extended family name that training records still used, sometime around the period of his early field assignments. The exact timing is another gap in the record, but by the time his name appears in correspondence associated with what historians call the revanchist movement, the faction of Jedi who were publicly agitating for Republic and Jedi intervention in the Mandalorian conflict, he is Alec. Squint in the intimate records, Alec in the formal ones, not yet anything else. The revanchist movement was led, in its most visible public form, by the Jedi, who would become Darth Revan. The records are clear on this. What is less often noted in the official histories is that Alec was not merely a follower of that movement. He was, by the accounts that survived Dantooine's destruction, one of its earliest and most vocal internal voices. He was not persuaded by Revan's arguments. He arrived at the same conclusions independently and found in Revan someone capable of articulating them to an audience that needed articulating. The distinction matters because it complicates the narrative that later histories tend to default to, the one where Alec is defined entirely by his relationship to Revan, where his choices are understood as derivatives of Revan's choices, where his fall is a shadow cast by a greater figure's fall. That narrative is available in the record, but the record also contains this: a young man who decided, before anyone told him to decide, that the distance between what was happening and what the Order was doing about it was unacceptable. He came to that conclusion on his own. What he did with it, who he brought it to, how it combined with Revan's strategic capacity and his own emotional urgency to produce something larger than either of them. This is the earliest visible mechanism of what would later become the most destructive war the Republic had faced in centuries. The road to the Jedi Civil War ran through this. Two young people in a Jedi training program who were each, in their different ways, correct about a real moral failure, and who had no institutional framework available to them that could hold what they were trying to do without breaking. The Jedi Council's response to the revanchist movement was, in its own way, a document. Not a formal document. The Council was careful about what it committed to written record in this period, but a behavioral one. The Council did not expel Revan or Alec. It did not formally sanction them. It expressed concern. It urged patience. It noted, in the measured language that official correspondence tends to favor, that the situation was being monitored and that direct Jedi involvement in external military conflict would require clearer authorization than currently existed. What the Council did not do, what the record cannot show it doing, is engage with the substance of what Revan and Alec were arguing. The Mandalorians were moving through the outer territories. People were dying. The Republic's military response was insufficient. These were not contested facts. They were simply facts that the Council's existing framework had no productive way to process. For Alec, this was not a philosophical disagreement. This was confirmation of what the incident on Taris had already shown him, that the institution he was a member of was capable of extraordinary formal commitment to the idea of protecting life, while declining to protect specific lives, because doing so would complicate its institutional position. He did not leave quietly. The records that survive from this period suggest he argued his position within every venue available to him. He sought conversations with council members. He submitted formal correspondence. He aligned himself publicly with Revan's cause at a time when that alignment was professionally dangerous, when the council was watching the revanchist movement with an expression the surviving records describe, with characteristic institutional understatement, as deep concern. He did all of this, and he did it with the urgency the record consistently associates with him, and he did not change anything. Eventually, he made a different choice. There is a moment, approximate in its dating, precise in its implication, where the surviving records mark a shift in how Alex's name appears in Jedi documentation. Before the shift, he appears in training records, in internal communications, in the kind of administrative documentation that accumulates around any member of an active organization. His name is present, in the way that any Jedi's name is present, embedded in the institutional life of the Order. After the shift, he disappears from those records almost entirely, not because he died, not because he was expelled, because he stopped being, in any meaningful institutional sense, a member of the Order the Council recognized. He followed Revan into the war the Council had declined to sanction. He departed with a group of Jedi who had concluded that the gap between the Order's values and the Order's behavior had become too wide to inhabit. The records note this departure. They do not record anyone going after him. What they do record is what came later, the figure who emerged from that war, from the years in the unknown regions that followed it, from exposure to forces that the surviving evidence still cannot fully characterize. A figure who wore a different name and whose face, by the time most people encountered him, was hidden behind a jaw plate of blue metal following an injury the record attributes to combat. His full face was not, after a certain point, something anyone saw. There is something in that detail that the investigation keeps returning to. The man who had been known as Squint, a name given because he was present, recognizable, seen, became someone who could not be seen at all. Not a metaphor, an actual fact of his later life. The lower half of his face, hidden, his voice, altered by whatever supported or replaced the jaw that had been destroyed. The face that trained on Dantooine. The face that stood on Taris and could not look away from suffering, hidden. The investigation does not know what to do with that detail, except to note it, and to carry it forward into the evidence that follows. There is one more thing the early records preserve that deserves attention before the investigation moves deeper. Among the fragments that survived Dantooine's destruction, rescued, by whatever combination of accident and intention, before the bombardment, is a short passage from a training report. It concerns Alec during a specific exercise, the nature of which the record describes only obliquely. But the evaluating master's note, at the close of the report, has survived intact. It reads, translated from the institutional language of the period, "He cares too much to be neutral, and too deeply to be corrected. This is either his gift or his destruction, and I cannot yet determine which." The master who wrote that note is not named in the surviving fragment. Their judgment, offered as a concern, phrased in the careful language of a formal evaluation, turned out to be the most accurate thing the record contains about the person it was describing. He cared too much to be neutral. He cared too deeply to be corrected, and in a very specific way that the investigation will spend the following chapters trying to understand. Those two qualities, which in another life, under other pressures, might have made him one of the most extraordinary Jedi of his generation, became the mechanism by which he was unmade. The next time the historical record places Alec near a Jedi temple, he is not arriving. He is not seeking counsel, or submitting correspondence, or arguing his position within any available venue. He is not standing on the steps with a war visible on the horizon, and a decision still in front of him. He is issuing the order. The temple on Dantooine, the same complex that housed the records of his training, the evaluation that called him uncorrectable, the fragmentary archive of the person he had been, burned from the inside out as orbital bombardment found its mark, with the precision that only someone who knew exactly what was there could direct. Whether he knew what was there when he gave the order, the investigation cannot confirm. What it can confirm is that the archives did not survive, and neither, in any recognizable sense, did the person the archives had documented. The distance between those 2 points, Alec on the steps and Malak giving the order, is what this investigation exists to measure. It will not close that distance entirely. No investigation can. But the evidence that follows will make it possible, if not to understand, then at least to stand inside the question, with enough clarity to know precisely what cannot be answered. That is where the investigation begins. Wars do not begin where historians say they begin. The official record of the Mandalorian Wars places its start at a specific engagement, a specific date, a specific border crossing, a specific military confrontation that the Republic Senate formally acknowledged and the Jedi Council formally noted with concern. That is where the documents say the war started. The people who lived through it would have placed the beginning somewhere else entirely, earlier, quieter, in the specific moment when they understood that no one was coming. That understanding arrived at different times on different worlds. On Althar, it arrived when the Mandalorian fleet entered orbit, and the Republic response was a communique, expressing deep concern about escalating tensions. On Cathar, it arrived, or rather, it did not arrive, because the people on Cathar did not have time to understand anything before what happened there was already finished. On dozens of worlds whose names appear in the surviving refugee records and nowhere else, that understanding came in the form of a silence where the sound of help should have been. The Mandalorian Crusaders, and later the Neo-Crusaders under Mandalore the Ultimate, were not conducting a conventional military campaign. What the historical record documents, assembled from the accounts of survivors and the reports of Republic observers who were present but not intervening, is something that operated simultaneously on multiple levels. There was military conquest, direct, overwhelming, efficient. There was cultural absorption, the imposition of Mandalorian values, hierarchy, and identity on populations that had not chosen them. And there was, in specific documented instances, systematic culling, the removal of populations deemed unfit for either absorption or service. The word culling appears in the records with an administrative flatness that the investigation finds worth noting. Not massacre, not atrocity. Culling, the language of livestock management applied to the populations of occupied worlds. What that language revealed about the Mandalorian command structure's understanding of the beings it was processing, and what it revealed about the Republic officials who adopted the terminology in their own reporting, is a thread the investigation will not pull on here, except to note its presence. What matters to this chapter is what all of this looked like to a young Jedi who could feel suffering the way other people heard sound. The Force does not work the way popular understanding tends to assume. It is not, according to any serious scholarly tradition within the Jedi records, a communication system. It does not transmit specific information across specific distances in real time. What it does, what Force-sensitive beings consistently report across thousands of years of documented experience, is something more like resonance, a sensitivity to the emotional and experiential states of living beings that, at sufficient intensity, crosses the distance between worlds without traveling it. Alec, based on the evaluations recorded before the archives were destroyed, had that sensitivity in an unusually high degree. What this meant, practically, during the period when the Mandalorian occupation was expanding across the outer territories, is that the suffering the records document so carefully in their administrative language was not, for him, administrative. It was not a policy problem, or a geopolitical concern, or a matter for the appropriate Republic channels to address through the appropriate Republic processes. It was something he could feel, not metaphorically, not as an abstract moral awareness, but as a specific and continuous pressure that the Force carried to him from places he had never been. The Jedi Order's training program prepared its students for many things. It did not, by the evidence of this period, prepare them adequately for what it felt like to be Force-sensitive during a systematic atrocity that the institution they belonged to had decided to observe from a careful distance. The Council's position, documented in the correspondence that survived because it was housed in locations other than Dantooine, held that Jedi intervention in what it characterized as an external military conflict would compromise the Order's neutrality, its relationship with the Senate, and its ability to serve as a peacekeeping force in a galaxy where peacekeeping required credibility on all sides. This argument was not made cynically. The masters who made it believed it. The records of those deliberations suggest they found it genuinely painful to maintain a position that allowed suffering to continue, and that they maintained it because they concluded the alternative would produce greater suffering in the long run. The argument was not without logic. It was also, to someone feeling what Alec was feeling from across the galaxy, simply unbearable. The revanchist movement, the faction of Jedi who publicly and increasingly loudly argued for intervention, was not, despite how later histories sometimes frame it, a group of reckless idealists who had abandoned reason for emotion. The records that survive from its internal discussions suggest something more complicated. People who had arrived at the same conclusion through different paths, united by a shared assessment that the gap between the Order's stated values and its current behavior had become too wide to maintain without acknowledging what the gap was. Alec's path to that conclusion has already been described. The force sensitivity, the low tolerance for distance between suffering and response, the encounter on Taris. Revan's path was different, more strategic, more calculated, and in a specific way, more frightening in retrospect. Where Alec felt his way to the conclusion, Revan reasoned his way there. He had assessed the military situation, the Republic's capabilities, the trajectory of the Mandalorian advance, and what he determined was the mathematical certainty of where things were heading without intervention. His argument to the Council was not primarily moral. It was predictive. He told them what would happen if the Republic continued on its current course, outlined the evidence, and presented the intervention he proposed as the only available corrective. The Council remained unconvinced. What made Revan and Alec so effective as a combined force within the revanchist movement was precisely this difference in their approaches. Revan could explain why intervention was strategically necessary. Alec could explain, or rather embody, why it was morally urgent. Together they addressed both the head and something deeper than the head in the Jedi who were listening. Many of those Jedi listened. There is a documented moment, preserved in a source that has no reason to embellish it, a routine supply manifest from a Republic way station near the Outer Rim, where a group of Jedi transports is logged passing through without filing a standard flight plan. The date places this in the period just before the major engagements of what would become the Mandalorian Wars. The transports are not identified by name. Their destination is logged as unknown. The supply master who recorded the entry added a personal note, which survived because it was embedded in a document concerned with inventory rather than military history, and therefore was not considered significant enough to archive selectively. The note reads, "More of them today. Young ones mostly." They had that look. The investigation does not know what look the supply master meant, but the investigation has a reasonable hypothesis. It is the look of people who have decided that waiting is no longer a form of wisdom, who have passed through the argument phase, and the formal correspondence phase, and the respectful disagreement phase, and who have arrived somewhere past all of that, at a decision so settled that it no longer requires ongoing justification. A look that is not excited and not frightened, because excitement and fear both belong to a future that is still uncertain, and these people have stopped experiencing the future as uncertain. They know what they are going to do. They have, by the time that supply master sees them, already done it in every way that matters. The specific moral logic that Alec and the other revanchists carried into the war is worth examining carefully, because later accounts have a tendency to flatten it in one of two directions, either presenting it as obviously correct in hindsight, or presenting it as obviously naive in retrospect. The evidence from within the period supports neither simplification. The Mandalorians were, objectively, doing what the records say they were doing. The occupation was real. The suffering was documented by Republic observers on the ground. The trajectory of the advance, as Revan had outlined to the Council, was pointing at increasingly Central Republic worlds. The case for intervention was not manufactured. It was assembled from actual evidence about an actual situation. And the Council's counter-argument, that Jedi intervention would compromise the Order's neutrality and long-term effectiveness, was also not manufactured. The history of Force-wielder factions becoming entangled in galactic conflicts and emerging from those conflicts changed in ways that compromised their independence is long and well documented. The Council was not inventing a concern, it was citing precedent. Both positions were defensible. Both positions had real costs. The people who made each choice were not, at the moment they made it, obviously wrong. This matters because what followed, the transformation of people like Alec into something the galaxy found difficult to recognize, cannot be understood as the inevitable consequence of a bad decision made by reckless people. The decision was not clearly bad at the point it was made. The people were not reckless. The consequences could not be read from the premises. This is one of the things that makes the investigation necessary. If the fall of Alex Quinquagesimus were the story of a flawed person making an obviously wrong choice, it would be a simpler document to assemble. It is not that story. It is the story of a person with genuine conviction making a genuinely defensible choice. And what happened after that is what the investigation is trying to understand. The early years of Jedi involvement in the Mandalorian Wars produced something unexpected, documented in multiple sources from the period. The Jedi who had chosen to fight were, by most accounts, extraordinarily effective. Not because Force sensitivity made them better soldiers in any simple mechanical sense, but because the combination of Force ability and genuine moral conviction produced a quality in the field that the Mandalorians, who respected strength above almost all other qualities, had not anticipated encountering in Republic-aligned forces. The Neo-Crusaders had expected soldiers. They had encountered something else. Alec, in the field engagements documented from this period, appears consistently in accounts that emphasize the same quality the training evaluation had noted years earlier: the urgency, the unwillingness to let suffering continue a moment longer than it had to. In the context of war, this quality translated into tactical recklessness in some situations and extraordinary effectiveness in others. He led from the front. He treated the soldiers under his command as people whose lives mattered rather than resources to be allocated. He was, by the surviving accounts of those who served with him, the kind of officer that soldiers would follow past the point where following was strategically advisable. The records note that this made him beloved. The records also note, in a way that the investigation finds worth sitting with, that this quality, the urgency, the refusal to hold back, the willingness to spend himself completely in service of the people who needed him, was not diminished by the war. It was amplified. The war gave it a context where it could operate at full intensity without institutional friction, which raises a question the investigation cannot answer. Only ask, did the war reveal who Alec was, or did the war make him into someone he had not previously been? Is the urgency that the training evaluation noted the same urgency that drove his conduct in combat? Or did combat transform that quality into something that merely resembled its origin? The records preserve the behavior, they do not preserve the interior. There was a population of refugees from the Mandalorian advance that passed through Republic space during the middle years of the war, and the documentation of their movement survives in transit records and resettlement reports that no one has had reason to synthesize until now. They came from worlds whose names appear in Mandalorian conquest records, and nowhere else. Worlds that do not exist in current star charts, because they were absorbed into Mandalorian-held territory so completely that their original designations were retired. The people from those worlds described, in the accounts gathered by Republic resettlement administrators, what it had been like when the Mandalorians came. Not the military engagement. That part was often brief. What they described was the period after, the occupation, the restructuring, the process by which the world they had lived on was methodically converted into something that served Mandalorian purposes, while the people who had previously lived on it were sorted into categories of usefulness. One account, preserved in a resettlement administrator's report from a station near Tion Cluster, describes a woman. Her name is recorded, but her world is not, because by the time she reached the station, her world had been redesignated, who said the following: "We kept thinking someone would come, not because we had been promised someone would come, just because we could not believe they would let it continue." The investigation does not know whether Alec ever read this account or anything like it. The timeline suggests he was already in the field by the time this particular document was compiled, but accounts like it were reaching the Republic, reaching the Jedi, reaching anyone paying attention throughout the war. This was the context in which he operated. This was what the war felt like from the inside of it. Not a strategic problem to be solved, but an ongoing emergency where every delay had a specific human cost that could be counted. If you were willing to count it, he was willing. What the revanchist Jedi did not carry into the war, what the records suggest almost none of them thought to calculate, was the cost of what they were asking from themselves. The Jedi tradition had, over centuries, developed specific practices around exposure to large-scale suffering, methods for remaining present to pain without being consumed by it, frameworks for acting in the world without losing the internal orientation that made purposeful action possible. These practices were not, for the most part, suited to sustained combat operations in a galaxy-wide war. They had been designed for peacekeeping, for negotiation, for the careful and measured engagement with conflict that the Order's institutional role demanded. They had not been designed for Malachor Vive. That is the next chapter of the investigation. But before arriving there, before the record turns toward what happened at that battle and what it produced, the investigation needs to name something the evidence keeps returning to and keeps not saying directly. Every person who later described what happened to Alec, to Revan, to the Jedi who followed them, described the war as the point where things began to change. Not a specific battle, not a specific decision. The war itself, the sustained exposure to suffering on that scale, the sustained requirement to respond to it with violence, the sustained removal of every institutional buffer between moral urgency and direct action. The war made doing exactly what they had wanted to do possible. It gave their urgency a field in which it could operate without friction, and it gave the dark side, which has always found friction the most useful tool available to those trying to resist it, nothing to work with. They departed for that war, Revan and Alec and the Jedi who had chosen to follow them, past a supply way station where an anonymous official noted their passage in a manifest that was not meant to be historical. The records do not preserve a formal leave-taking. There is no documented final conversation between Revan and the Council. No recorded words from Alec as he crossed whatever line he understood himself to be crossing. Whatever was said, or not said, in those final moments before departure is another gap in the archive. What the record does preserve is what came after. The battles, the campaigns, the deepening of everything. The training evaluation had called his gift and his destruction, now operating at full intensity in a context that demanded nothing less. And somewhere ahead of that departure, not visible yet, not conceivable yet to the people boarding those transports, the battle that would end the war and the years in the unknown regions that would follow it, the return that would not be a return, the names that neither of them were using yet. None of them understood what leaving the Order's sanction would cost. The record is clear on this, not because it says so, but because of what it shows in the years that followed. People who understood the cost do not pay it the way they paid it. Some events leave marks on the physical world, craters, debris fields, radiation signatures that persist for centuries in the upper atmosphere of a planet that should not have an upper atmosphere anymore, because the thing that happened there should have consumed it entirely. Malachor V left all of those marks. It also left something the instruments could not measure, something that Force-sensitive beings who passed near the system in the decades following the battle described consistently, independently, and without apparent coordination. A feeling, not grief exactly, not horror, though those words appear in some accounts. Something older than either of those. A specific quality of wrongness that had no clean category in the vocabulary available to describe it. The planet still existed after the battle. That was, in its own way, the strangest part. It had been compressed, fractured, its gravity manipulated by a weapon unlike anything the Republic had previously deployed, and it remained, broken, suspended, a thing that should not have survived in the condition it was in, somehow persisting. The investigation finds that detail worth noting, not because it carries symbolic weight that the script intends to impose, but because the records keep returning to it. Malachor V survived what happened at Malachor Vive, and the people who were present when it happened also survived, some of them, in a condition the records struggle to characterize. This chapter is about what surviving that looked like. For Alec, for Revan, for the Jedi who had followed them into a war and now stood on the other side of its ending, trying to determine what they were standing in. The mass shadow generator was not a weapon anyone talked about publicly before the battle. Its existence appears in pre-battle records, only in deeply classified Republic military correspondence. Documents whose survival is itself somewhat improbable, given how thoroughly the relevant archives were later compromised. What those documents establish is this: the weapon was real, it was deployed deliberately, and the people who authorized its use understood its basic operational parameters before authorizing them. What those parameters meant, in human terms, was somewhat harder to convey in the formal language of military authorization. The mass shadow generator manipulated gravitational fields on a planetary scale, activated in the vicinity of Malachor V, a world already noted for unusual gravitational properties. It would create a crushing effect across a defined region of space that would destroy any ship caught within it. The Mandalorian fleet, concentrated for what its commanders expected to be a decisive engagement, would be eliminated. What the authorization documents do not dwell on, though they acknowledge it in the compact phrasing of military planning, is that the weapon did not distinguish between Mandalorian vessels and Republic ones. It could not. Gravitational force applied at planetary scale does not carry allegiance. General Mitra Surik gave the order to activate it. She was a Jedi. She had followed Revan into the war from the same idealistic starting point as Alec, through the same years of combat, arriving at the same final engagement. She activated the weapon, she survived. And what the Force did to her when the weapon fired, what the death of so many beings in a single instant, at her command, produced in a person sensitive to the lives of others, was something the records have never fully described, and the investigation cannot fully reconstruct. What is documented is that she survived, and that she was, afterward, different. The word the historical record most consistently applies to Mitra Surik following Malachor V is wound, not metaphorically. The Force tradition has specific language for what happens when a Force-sensitive being is present at the deaths of large numbers of people, an event that resonates through the Force, the way a physical impact resonates through a structure, with aftershocks that can persist long after the initial event. What happened to Surik was, by the accounts that survive, a wound of that kind. She cut herself off from the Force as a response to what she had felt when it fired. The separation was not a choice in the way ordinary choices work. It was more like a reflex, the instinctive closure of a nerve ending that has experienced more than it can process. She would spend years in that separation. What eventually brought her back to the Force is a different investigation. What matters here is what her experience at Malachor V reveals about the scale of what happened, and what it implies about what everyone else present experienced. Alec was at Malachor V. The historical record confirms this. He was present for the battle, part of the revanchist forces that had assembled for what Revan had planned as the final engagement of the Mandalorian conflict. He held a command position. He survived. What the record does not confirm, because no document survives that captures it, is what the activation of the mass shadow generator felt like from his position. What it felt like for a person with his specific Force sensitivity, the same sensitivity that had made the suffering of occupied worlds reach him across interstellar distances. The same quality that training evaluations had described as the thing that would either define or destroy him, to be present when that weapon fired. The Force carries the deaths of sentient beings. This is not a metaphor in the tradition that trained Alec. It is a documented, studied phenomenon with specific effects on specific types of individuals. What the weapon produced was tens of thousands of deaths compressed into moments. Republic soldiers, Mandalorian warriors, support personnel, everyone caught in the gravitational field when it activated, and the Force carried all of it. The investigation cannot know what Alec felt. It can note what the evidence shows he became in the period that followed. The divergence between Revan and Alec, the first visible separation between two people who had, until this point, been moving in the same direction, appears in the records of the weeks and months after Malachor V. Revan's response to the battle, based on the documentary evidence from this period, was analytical. He processed what had happened, assessed its implications, and moved forward with calculation. The records from his conduct in the immediate aftermath show a commander who had won a war and was already thinking about what came next, not emotionally detached. The evidence does not suggest that, but capable of containing what he had experienced within a framework that allowed him to function strategically. What he was thinking about in those weeks was a question the war had raised for him that the war itself had not answered. The Mandalorians had been stopped, but the question of why they had moved when they did, the specific timing, the specific character of the campaign, did not, to Revan's analytical assessment, have a satisfying explanation in the evidence available within known space. He was already looking toward the unknown regions, before anyone realized he was looking anywhere. Alec's response to Malachor V was different. The accounts that survive from people who interacted with him in the period following the battle describe someone who was present but altered, still functioning, still commanding, still recognizable as the person he had been before, but carrying something that had not been there previously, a quality the accounts struggle to name, reaching for words like hollowed and sharpened and stripped in ways that suggest a person who had lost something interior without being able to identify what it was or when it went. The Mandalorian Wars had ended. The thing that had given his urgency a purpose, the ongoing emergency that had justified every departure from the Order's sanction, had resolved. And what was left in the space that purpose had occupied was not peace. It was not relief. It was something the records suggest he did not know what to do with. The investigation cannot say with certainty that Malachor V broke something in Alec that had not previously been broken. It can say that before Malachor V, the records describe a person moving forward with conviction. After it, they describe a person moving forward without the conviction being visible anymore, as if the motion had continued, but the reason for it had gone somewhere the records cannot follow. The Mandalorian survivors of Malachor V presented the Republic with a specific problem that the historical record handles somewhat awkwardly. Mandalore the Ultimate was dead. His fleet was destroyed. The campaign that had reshaped the Outer Territories was finished. By any formal measure, the war was over and the Republic had won. What remained was the question of what winning looked like. What happened to the Mandalorian forces that survived? What happened to the worlds that had been occupied? What happened to the people who had been displaced, absorbed, or eliminated in the course of the campaign? The records from this period, Republic Senate debates, military decommissioning documents, relief agency reports, are extensive. What they reveal, assembled together, is a victory that resolved the military problem while leaving most of the human problems it had generated entirely unaddressed. Occupied worlds were liberated in the formal sense. The structures the Mandalorians had imposed on them were nominally dissolved. The people who had been living under those structures for years were largely left to manage the aftermath without the institutional support that would have made managing it possible. This is the kind of outcome that tends to produce, in people who cared deeply about why the war was fought in the first place, something between exhaustion and disillusionment. Not betrayal. The Republic had not promised anything specific. But the gap between the moral urgency that had justified entering the conflict and the institutional indifference that characterized the response to its conclusion was, for someone with Alec's specific relationship to moral gaps, not a comfortable thing to inhabit. He had crossed every line the Council drew, because people were suffering and no one was helping. The war ended. The helping, by the evidence of the post-war record, was incomplete in ways that the people who had suffered would feel for generations. Whether this contributed to what came next is a question the investigation cannot definitively answer. It can note the timing. The force wound at Malak Viv was not only Mitra Surik's. This is an aspect of the historical record that tends to receive less attention than it deserves, possibly because Surik's wound was the most dramatic and the most thoroughly documented. She had given the order, she was the most proximate cause, she bore the most visible consequence. Her account is the one the records preserved in most detail. But Force-sensitive beings who were present at Malak V without giving the order also reported effects in the period following the battle. The accounts are scattered. Some appear in Jedi communications that were later consolidated and partially redacted, some in personal records that survived by accident rather than design. They describe, with variation in phrasing and considerable variation in the severity of what they report, something similar to what Surik experienced, but in smaller degree. A sensitivity to death on that scale could not simply be filed and moved past. It had to go somewhere. And where it went, for the Jedi present at Malak V, was different for different people. Some toward withdrawal, some toward anger, some toward a kind of numbness that the records describe as purposeful, but that reads, from the outside, as something chosen rather than felt. The force wound at Malak V was, based on this evidence, not a singular event that affected one person. It was a distributed event that affected everyone present in the force, and that distributed differently through different individuals based on what they carried going in and what they had available for processing what they received. What Alec carried going in, years of accumulated moral urgency, the specific sensitivity the training evaluations had flagged, and the end of the purpose that had given those qualities a direction. What he had available for processing, the record does not say. What he emerged carrying, the investigation is still working toward that. The Jedi Council's response to Malak V was, in its own way, as revealing as the battle itself. The Council had spent years expressing deep concern about Revan and Alec's departure from sanctioned conduct. It had maintained its position that Jedi involvement in the Mandalorian Wars was inappropriate. It had, throughout the conflict, operated as if the distinction between its institutional position and moral reality could be sustained indefinitely. Malak Viv made that position considerably harder to maintain. A Jedi general had activated a superweapon that killed tens of thousands of beings, including a significant number of Republic soldiers. The war had been won. The weapon's use and what it had done were now part of the public record in ways that the Council's previous careful silence could not address. What the Council did, documented in the correspondence that survives from the period, was convene. It discussed Mitra Surik. It discussed the conduct of Jedi who had fought without sanction. It discussed what responses were appropriate and proportionate. It was, by the documentary evidence, a thorough and genuinely difficult institutional conversation that produced the decision to exile Surik and to formally note the conduct of the Jedi who had participated in the unsanctioned campaign. What the Council apparently did not do, in the records that survive, is ask what the war had done to the people who fought it. Not as a formal inquiry, not as a pastoral response, not as the simple question, asked of individuals, not committees, that the evidence suggests might have mattered most in those specific weeks. What happened to you? The question is not in the surviving records. The investigation cannot confirm it was never asked, but the absence of any documented answer suggests the asking, if it occurred, was not treated as something the institution needed to preserve. Revan told Alec what he had found, or what he suspected. The records do not preserve the content of that conversation. They preserve only the outcome, both of them departing for the unknown regions, together, without Council sanction, in the period following the war's end. The timing is documented. The stated reason is not. The Jedi Council's records from this period note the departure with the same careful bureaucratic language that had characterized its communications throughout the revanchist period. Concern was expressed. The situation was being monitored. Appropriate responses would be considered. What the record notes, and what the investigation finds more significant than the language used to describe it, is this. Two people who had just spent years fighting a war that their institution had told them not to fight, chose, immediately afterward, to do another thing their institution had told them not to do, and the institution's response was, again, to express concern and monitor the situation. The pattern of that dynamic, the Council's repeated expression of concern about people who had already made their decision and were already moving, is something the investigation will return to. For now, the important thing is the departure itself. They left known space. The record follows them to the boundary, where maps became speculation, and then the record stops. When they came back, they were using different names. The investigation will spend the next chapter standing at that boundary, looking into the silence beyond it, trying to determine what the silence contains. There are places in the galaxy where the official record simply ends, not because nothing happened there, because no one with authority to document it survived long enough to do so, or because the people who came back from those places decided, for reasons the investigation can only partially reconstruct, that what they had found should not be committed to archives that anyone might read. The unknown regions, in the period following the Mandalorian Wars, were both of those things simultaneously. Revan and Alec departed into them together. They returned, after a period the records place at somewhere between 1 and 2 years, as different people in a sense more fundamental than the names they had adopted. What happened in the interval is one of the most thoroughly examined gaps in all of Old Republic historical scholarship. Examined not because the evidence is rich, but because the evidence is almost entirely absent, and the absence has a shape that rewards careful attention. The investigation cannot enter that gap. It can stand at its edges and map what the edges reveal. The unknown regions were not, in this period, entirely unexplored. Republic scouts had charted portions of them. Jedi missions had touched their inner boundaries at various points across centuries of recorded history. What made them unknown was not the complete absence of documentation, but the specific character of the documentation that existed. Fragmentary, contradictory, often produced under conditions that compromised its reliability. What the accumulated records of those earlier expeditions consistently note is a quality of the space itself that made navigation difficult in ways that exceeded the technical challenges of mapping uncharted territory. Hyperspace routes that should have been calculable were not. Ships that entered certain regions did not return, not in numbers that suggested mechanical failure, but in numbers that suggested something about those regions was resistant to being found. Force-sensitive scouts reported, with enough consistency to constitute a pattern, a specific sensation in the unknown regions that they described as pressure. Not physical pressure, something that pushed against awareness rather than against a hull. The investigation does not have access to what Revan was specifically looking for when he departed into those regions, but it has access to the broader context of what the Mandalorian War had raised for him, the question of why the campaign had begun when it did, with the specific character it had, at the specific moment in Republic history it chose. That question pointed toward the unknown regions, because the evidence available in known space did not answer it. Something had set the Mandalorians in motion. Something had timed the campaign, directed its character, aimed it at the Republic with a precision that felt, to someone examining it analytically, less like the autonomous decision of a warrior culture and more like the opening move of something larger. Revan was, by the evidence of his conduct throughout the war, a person who did not accept incomplete explanations when more complete ones were available. He had found an incomplete explanation. He went to find the rest of it. What he found, what both of them found, or were exposed to, or were shaped by, is where the record stops cooperating. The name that survives from the deepest historical accounts of this period is one the investigation must handle carefully, because the sources that contain it are themselves contested. Vitiate, the Sith Emperor, an entity whose existence was, in the period following the Mandalorian Wars, unknown to the Republic, the Jedi Order, and essentially all of known galactic civilization. An intelligence that had survived for centuries through methods the investigation does not have space to fully examine here, operating from a base of power in the unknown regions, patient in a way that entities of ordinary lifespan cannot be patient. What the surviving legend's sources establish, sources that are themselves fragmentary, produced long after the events they describe, dependent on testimony from people who experienced what they describe under conditions that did not favor objective documentation, is that Revan and Alek encountered this entity, that the encounter was not incidental, that what Vitiate was capable of doing to minds that entered his presence was something the galaxy had no framework for understanding at the time. The investigation presents this evidence with the care it requires. These sources are real. The entity they describe is documented across multiple independent traditions within the legend's continuity. The encounter almost certainly occurred. The behavioral evidence from what Revan and Alek became supports the existence of an encounter with something that operated beyond ordinary dark side influence. What the investigation cannot confirm is the degree of Vitiate's direct influence on what Alek specifically became. The sources that address this most directly are also the ones most dependent on retrospective reconstruction. They were written after the fact, by people attempting to explain outcomes that had already occurred. The risk of that kind of documentation, the risk of finding causes that fit effects rather than causes that produce them, is real, and the investigation acknowledges it. What can be said with reasonable confidence? Revan and Alek entered the unknown regions as people shaped by war and disillusionment. They encountered something there that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. They returned as Sith Lords. The connection between those three facts is not coincidental. The exact mechanism of that connection is where the record's silence sits. The parallel the investigation finds most useful here is not from the distant past. It is from much later, from a figure the galaxy knows considerably better than it knows Alex Quinquagesimus. Count Dooku of Sereno left the Jedi Order under circumstances that had more in common with Alek's trajectory than the surface differences suggest. He was a Jedi of exceptional ability and genuine philosophical depth, who had grown, over decades of service, profoundly disillusioned with the Order's institutional capacity to address the corruption he observed in the Republic it served. He did not leave in anger, exactly. The records from that period describe his departure as deliberate, considered, the conclusion of a long internal process, rather than an impulsive break. He left because he had concluded that the institution could not be what it claimed to be, while operating within the constraints it had accepted. And then he encountered Darth Sidious. The parallel is not that Dooku and Alek were the same person, or that their falls followed identical paths. They did not. Dooku was older, more philosophical, less urgency-driven. His darkness had a different texture, more architectural, more patient, more shaped by specific intellectual positions than by the kind of raw moral pressure Alek carried. The parallel is in the structure, a Jedi with genuine grievances against the Order's limitations, a departure from that Order, an encounter with a Sith intelligence of extraordinary power and patience, a return as something the Order no longer recognized. Dooku encountered Sidious. Revan and Alek encountered Vitiate. Neither encounter left its subject intact. What the parallel clarifies is not the content of what happened in the unknown regions. It clarifies the shape of how such encounters tend to operate. Sith intelligences, of the kind the investigation is describing, do not work through direct coercion, according to the sources available. They work through already existing fractures. They find the place where a person's genuine convictions have produced genuine wounds, and they enter through those wounds, offering something that feels, from the inside, like a completion rather than a corruption. Alek had genuine wounds. The war had produced them. Malachor V had deepened them. What he carried into the unknown regions was a person whose moral urgency had been operating at full intensity for years, whose purpose had ended without resolution, and whose institutional home had spent the entire war expressing concern about him from a careful distance. Something in those regions found that combination workable. The Jedi Council knew that Revan and Alek had departed for the unknown regions. The documentation confirms this. What the Council did with that knowledge is a thread the investigation notes with interest. It waited. not in the way that waiting sometimes constitutes active attention. Monitoring, reaching out to contacts near the boundary of known space, deploying scouts to track the direction of departure. The records do not show those activities occurring with any urgency. The Council waited in the way that a body accustomed to expressing concern and monitoring situations waits, by maintaining its existing position and noting the absence of new information. The people who might have gone after them, who might have used the Force to locate two specific signatures in uncharted space, as Jedi had done in other contexts for other purposes, did not go. The records do not explain why. The investigation cannot determine whether this reflects a considered judgment that pursuit was inadvisable, a failure of institutional will, or something else the documentary record has not preserved. What it reflects, in effect, is another gap in the record, shaped by absence of action rather than absence of documentation. When Revan and Alec came back, it was not through any retrieval effort. They came back because they chose to, or because whatever had happened to them in the unknown regions had given them a reason to return. That was its own kind of compulsion. They came back as Darth Revan and Darth Malak, with a fleet the Republic had not known they were building, and the Jedi Civil War began. The records from the opening of the Jedi Civil War describe the Republic's response to the returning fleet with a quality that reads, in retrospect, as something between shock and a delayed recognition that this outcome had always been possible. The Jedi Council, facing people it had trained and monitored and expressed concern about for years, now encountering them as commanders of a military force that had declared war on the civilization they had previously defended, produced the kind of institutional response that reveals what an institution is made of when the frameworks it has maintained for decades are no longer adequate. It convened, it discussed, it eventually produced, after deliberation, a plan. The plan that would involve Bastila Shan and a team of Jedi boarding Revan's flagship during a specific engagement, attempting to capture rather than kill, which produced the outcome the investigation's later chapters will examine in detail. What the investigation notes here, at the end of this chapter, is the quality of the Council's position throughout this entire arc, from Alec's training, through the revanchist period, through the war, through the departure, through the return, through the opening of the Jedi Civil War. The Council's posture had been consistent. It expressed concern. It maintained its position. It waited to see what developed. What developed was Darth Malak. The investigation does not claim the Council caused what Alec became. The causal question is more complicated than that, and the following chapters will examine its components carefully. But the investigation does note this. At every point where a different kind of institutional engagement, more direct, more personal, more willing to treat the people in question as individuals rather than problems to be managed, might have altered something, the Council chose the institutional response. The record preserves what that choice produced. The names Darth Revan and Darth Malak appear in Republic military records for the first time in documents dated to the opening months of the Jedi Civil War. Before those documents, neither name exists anywhere in the surviving archive. After them, neither name disappears. The people who had left as Alec and Revan, as Squint and the Revanchist's most recognizable face, as two young Jedi who had believed the Council was wrong, had become something the language required new words for. What the unknown regions gave those words their content is a silence the investigation cannot fill. It can only note the dimensions of the silence and carry what it implies into the evidence that follows. Witnesses are not cameras. This is the first thing the investigation must establish before examining what Bastila Shan reported, because the temptation, when a witness is articulate, when their account is detailed, when they were genuinely present for the events they describe, is to receive their testimony as documentation rather than interpretation, to treat what they saw as equivalent to what happened. Bastila Shan was articulate. Her account of the time she spent in Malak's custody is the most detailed first-person record the investigation has access to. She was present. She was close. She was, by every measure available, a credible and intelligent observer. She was also someone who had nearly become what she was observing. That distinction does not invalidate her testimony. It shapes it in ways the investigation must account for before extracting anything reliable from what she reported. A person who has stood at the edge of a conversion attempt and pulled back from it carries that experience into every account they give of the person who attempted it. They cannot separate what they saw from what they felt. The investigation does not ask them to. It asks, instead, that we read the account, knowing the position from which it was produced. With that established, what Bastila Shan saw is the closest the record comes to the interior of Darth Malak. She was captured during a specific engagement, a moment in the Jedi Civil War where a mission she was part of encountered Malak's forces directly. The circumstances of the capture are documented in Republic military records, with the detail that military records tend to preserve: positions, timing, the tactical situation that allowed it to happen. What those records do not preserve is the decision Malak made in the moments that followed. He chose not to kill her. In a war where Jedi who fell into Sith hands were, by the evidence of the broader record, not generally kept alive for extended periods, Malak made a different calculation. He brought her aboard his flagship. He kept her there. He engaged with her personally. Over a period of time, the surviving accounts place at several weeks. The investigation has examined this decision from multiple angles across the preparation of this account, and returned, each time, to the same conclusion. The decision to keep Bastila alive is one of the most revealing things Malak did during the entire war. More revealing, in some respects, than the bombardments and the fleet engagements and the strategic decisions that produced the war's military shape, because it was a decision made outside strategic logic, outside anything the record can explain through the vocabulary of military necessity or political calculation. He wanted something from her that killing her would not provide. What he wanted, based on Bastila's subsequent account, was not primarily her battle meditation, though that gift was real, was documented, and was strategically significant enough that it would have justified keeping her alive on purely military grounds. He wanted to show her something. This is the thread in Bastila's testimony that the investigation finds most significant and also most difficult to interpret. She reports, in the accounts preserved from the period following her rescue, that Malak spent a considerable portion of their interactions not demanding her cooperation or threatening consequences for its absence, but explaining, presenting, making a case. The case he was making, as she reconstructed it, was about the nature of power, specifically the nature of force ability and what it was genuinely for. He argued, according to her account, that the Jedi model of the Force as something to be held in balance, to be served rather than wielded, to be approached with restraint and philosophical caution, was a kind of deliberate diminishment, a framework designed to limit what Force-sensitive beings could become, justified through a tradition of institutional self-preservation rather than genuine wisdom. He had heard this argument before. Some version of it had been developing in him since the training evaluation that called him uncorrectable, since the Taris encounter, since the years of watching the Council maintain its position while people died in the territories the Mandalorians were moving through. He had lived a version of it into the decision to go to war without sanction. What the war had done, and what the unknown regions had done, and what the dark side had done, was take that genuine original frustration and build something from it that the original frustration would not have recognized as its own. He believed what he was saying to Bastila. That is the thing her testimony most clearly conveys, and the thing the investigation finds most worth sitting with. He was not performing an argument to manipulate her. He had arrived at conclusions he genuinely held, and he was presenting them to someone he apparently thought was capable of following him there. The question of why he thought Bastila specifically was capable of following him there is one the investigation cannot answer definitively, but can approach. Bastila Shan was, in the period of the Jedi Civil War, younger than her role in the Republic's military strategy suggested, younger than the confidence she projected in official contexts. She had been identified early as Force-sensitive at an exceptional level. She had been trained within the very system Malak was arguing against, and she carried, the record suggests, her own version of the tension between genuine conviction and institutional constraint, a different version, quieter and more contained than Alex had ever been, but recognizable to someone who had spent years living with that particular friction. Whether Malak saw this in her through force sensitivity or through the kind of careful attention to individuals that the records suggest he was capable of when he chose to deploy it, the investigation cannot determine. What it can determine is that his choice of target was not random. He was not attempting to convert the nearest available Jedi. He was attempting to convert a specific person whose specific qualities he had assessed and found, in his estimation, workable. He had done something similar with Revan, in a different register, years earlier. Revan had found in Alec the urgency his own calculation lacked. Now Malak was looking at Bastila and finding something he apparently believed could be brought across the line he had crossed. The pattern matters. It suggests that one of the things Malak consistently sought across his entire adult life was someone who understood him, not who agreed with him, not who followed him, but who could actually track what he was doing and why. Someone whose capacity was sufficient to inhabit the same territory he was inhabiting. He had lost the person who had previously filled that position. She reported that he talked about Revan. Not constantly, not in a way that the reconstruction of her testimony suggests was obsessive or grief-stricken, but persistently, in a way that became its own kind of pattern across the weeks of their conversations. Revan appeared in his arguments as a reference point, as something he was explaining himself in relation to. What he said about Revan, filtered through Bastila's account, contains a quality the investigation finds genuinely difficult to categorize. He did not describe Revan as a master he had served. He did not describe Revan as a rival he had defeated. He did not use the language of hierarchy in either direction, above or below, when he placed himself in relation to the person whose ship he had ordered destroyed. The word Bastila eventually reached for, in describing how Malak characterized Revan, was understanding. Not that Revan had understood everything, or that Malak had understood Revan completely, but that between them, something like mutual recognition had existed that did not exist between either of them and anyone else in the galaxy. He had destroyed that. The investigation reads Bastila's account of this thread very carefully, because the interpretation is genuinely difficult. One reading is that Malak spoke of Revan this way to persuade Bastila, to suggest that he had once had a relationship of genuine depth, that he was capable of that depth, that following him into darkness did not mean abandoning the possibility of being truly known by another person. Under this reading, the Revan material was rhetorical strategy, deployed in service of conversion. Another reading is that he was telling her the truth, that what he missed, what the ambush at Lehon had taken from him, that power and victory could not replace, was not Revan's strategic capacity, or Revan's force ability, or the legitimizing presence of a senior partner. It was being understood, and that among everything the dark side had given him, and everything it had taken, that specific absence was the one he had not found a way to fill. Bastila could not determine which reading was correct. The investigation shares her uncertainty. The conversion attempt itself, the sustained effort across those weeks to bring Bastila from her Jedi commitments to whatever Malak was offering as an alternative, is documented in her testimony, with a specificity that suggests she had processed it carefully before committing it to record. He did not threaten her, in the way the investigation might have expected. There were no ultimatums of the form she would have been trained to recognize and resist. What he did instead was more methodical, and by her account, considerably more difficult to maintain resistance against. He argued, patiently, persistently. He took her counter-arguments seriously enough to engage with them directly, which produced the specific difficulty of being in a conversation with someone whose positions you oppose, but cannot easily dismiss, because they are tracking what you say and responding to it rather than overriding it. He offered her demonstrations, not of power in the coercive sense. He had already established the power differential between them through the circumstances of her captivity. Demonstrations of what the Force felt like on his side of the line she had been trained to maintain. The dark side, he argued, was not the perversion of something pure. It was the completion of something that the Jedi tradition had deliberately kept incomplete. She reported that she could feel what he was describing, That was the hardest part to commit to the record, and the part that the investigation treats as the most significant. She was not converted by his arguments alone. She was converted, partially, nearly, for a period she later described as genuine rather than performance, by the experience of what he was pointing at. She felt it. The power he was describing was real. The force as he was using it contained something that her training had not prepared her to encounter from the inside. She pulled back. Eventually, the record preserves her account of that process too, and it is not the story of a person who found the darkness obviously wrong and retreated from it with her convictions intact. It is the story of a person who found the darkness genuinely compelling and retreated from it anyway, which is a harder and more important kind of retreat. What brought her back is not the focus of this investigation. What matters here is what nearly pulled her across. She described it, in the account the investigation has access to, as the feeling of being seen completely, without the careful management that Jedi emotional discipline required, without the institutional filters through which she had learned to process her own nature. He saw her clearly. He reflected that clarity back, and for a period of time, she has been honest enough in her documentation not to minimize. That clarity felt like what she had been looking for. The investigation must ask, at this point, what Malak's conduct toward Bastila reveals about Malak, not about Bastila, whose account is the source material, but not the subject. About the man who planned and executed this extended and carefully calibrated attempt to bring another person across the line he had crossed. Several things emerge. He retained, throughout the Jedi Civil War, a capacity for patience that his reputation, built on the bombardments, the fleet engagements, the reputation for destructive force, does not obviously predict. The Bastila project required weeks of careful attention to another person's specific qualities and responses. That is not the work of someone who had lost the ability to see individuals within the larger military and political picture. He retained a genuine investment in being understood, not obeyed, not feared, though the fear was real, and the record preserves extensive documentation of it. Understood. He wanted Bastila to follow him, not because she had no choice, but because she had arrived at the same conclusions he had arrived at through her own reasoning. The distinction mattered to him. That it mattered is itself evidence about what kind of person he remained, inside whatever the war and the unknown regions and the dark side had constructed around him. He retained the capacity for something that the investigation, careful about the vocabulary it uses, will not call love, but will call attachment, of a specific and demanding kind. He saw potential in Bastila and wanted that potential expressed in a particular direction. Whether this was manipulation or genuine care, the investigation genuinely cannot determine. Possibly it was both simultaneously, in a way that the distinction between manipulation and genuine care had become, for him, no longer navigable. There is one final thread from Bastila's testimony that the investigation wants to examine before the chapter ends. She reported that in their last substantive conversation before her rescue, the conversation she had internally designated as the one where she had come closest to not returning, Malak said something about Revan that she found she could not immediately respond to. He said, in her reconstruction, that Revan had been the only person in the galaxy who understood what they were doing, not just what the plan was, not just what the strategy required, but why it mattered, in a way that went below strategy into something that could not be documented in military orders or political manifestos. He said that when Revan's ship went dark, and he understood that Bastila's boarding team had taken him, his first thought was not about what it meant for the war. It was about the specific quality of silence that came from being in a galaxy where the person who understood you was no longer, for whatever reason, available. He used a phrase Bastila recorded, but said she did not fully understand at the time. He called Revan the one who understood, not the one who led, or the one who saw further, or the one who was stronger. The one who understood. The investigation has been carrying that phrase since the outline of this chapter was first assembled, and it has not found a way to set it down. Because what it suggests about the ambush at Lihon, the order Malak gave to fire on Revan's ship, the act that every account of this period treats as the defining betrayal, is something the following chapter will need to approach carefully. He destroyed the one who understood him, and then he spent the rest of the war trying to replace that understanding with power, with victory, with the conversion of Bastila Shan, with everything except the thing that had actually been lost. Whether he knew what he was doing when he gave that order, whether he understood what the silence afterward would feel like, is a question the record cannot answer. The investigation turns, now, toward the silence itself, toward what was destroyed at Dantooine, and what the shape of that destruction tells the investigation about a man who spent a war erasing things he could not replace. The bombardment of the Dantooine Jedi Enclave did not make the major battle records. That fact alone is worth noting. The Jedi Civil War produced extensive military documentation, fleet engagements, planetary campaigns, Republic Senate emergency sessions, casualty reports submitted through the proper channels of an institution that was losing a war, and recording the fact of its losing with administrative thoroughness. These records survive in considerable volume. They cover engagements of genuine strategic significance and engagements of minimal strategic significance, with roughly equal documentary density. The Dantooine bombardment appears in them briefly, a few lines in a Republic intelligence summary, a notation in a Senate emergency session record, a short entry in a Jedi Council communication that acknowledges the loss of the Enclave, with the measured language the Council had by this point perfected for absorbing events it had not been able to prevent. That is all. For an event that destroyed one of the Jedi Order's most significant training and archival facilities outside of Coruscant, the documentary footprint is remarkably small. The investigation finds that smallness, itself, a form of evidence. The Dantooine Jedi Enclave was not a military installation. The distinction matters in ways that go beyond the obvious. Military installations, when destroyed in wartime, generate extensive documentation, after-action reports, damage assessments, analyses of what the destruction accomplished strategically. Their loss is measured against their function, and that measurement produces records. The Dantooine Enclave's function was different. It trained Jedi. It housed archives. It maintained records going back centuries. Records of students and their development, of courses of study, of assessments and evaluations, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of what it took to shape force-sensitive individuals into the kind of people the Order intended them to become. When it was destroyed, what was lost was not strategic capacity. What was lost was memory. The Republic's military apparatus did not have well-developed protocols for documenting the loss of memory. Its record-keeping systems were optimized for things that could be measured in tonnage and personnel and territorial control. The destruction of an archive produced entries in the records commensurate with the destruction of a building of similar physical dimensions. The building mattered about as much as what it contained. In the accounting systems that generated the documentation the investigation has access to, the actual weight of what was lost at Dantooine exists only in the silence where those records are not. The investigation has spent considerable effort attempting to reconstruct what the Dantooine archives contained at the time of their destruction. This is, by necessity, an exercise in working from context rather than direct evidence. The primary records are gone. What survives is the outline, references in other documents to the existence of records that no longer exist, the pattern of what would have been archived based on standard enclave practice, the specific knowledge that trained scholars of this period can bring to the question of what an institution of that type and age would have held. What emerges is a catalogue of absence. Student records going back to the enclave's founding, individual assessments, training progressions, evaluations from masters who had since died, the kind of granular personal documentation that captures individuals in development rather than in their final form. The investigation has already noted that Alex Quinquagesimus appears in exactly 3 surviving documents from his early life. Those 3 fragments survived because they were housed in locations other than Dantooine. What the Enclave held directly, evaluations from his time there, assessments from the masters who trained him, the fuller record of who he was and how he developed, and what specific qualities concerned or impressed the people responsible for his formation, is gone. Correspondence between the Dantooine Masters and the Central Jedi Council, covering the period of the revanchist movement's emergence, is also gone. The Council's side of that correspondence survives, partially, in Coruscant archives. The Dantooine side, the local perspective on what was developing, the assessments from people who had direct daily contact with Revan and Alec during the period when their positions were forming, does not. Mission records. Combat assessments from the early Mandalorian War period, filed by Jedi who trained at Dantooine before departing for the front. Historical analyses, produced by Enclave scholars during the war itself, examining what was happening and why. All of it gone. The shape of the absence is specific. It clusters around the people and the period the investigation is concerned with. Malak's targeting of Jedi repositories during the Civil War is a pattern the surviving records document, imperfectly, but consistently enough that the pattern is visible. Dantooine was not the only target. Several smaller Jedi facilities, outposts, training stations, archive caches maintained in locations outside the major population centers, were destroyed in the war, and the documentary evidence places responsibility for their destruction with forces under Malak's direct command in the majority of cases. The investigation has examined each documented instance and found, consistently, the same characteristic. These facilities were not militarily significant. They were not positioned near strategic choke points. They were not housing Jedi combat units or Republic military assets. In every case, the resources required to destroy them exceeded any plausible military return on that investment. By conventional military logic, these targets made no sense. The investigation does not claim this proves the targeting was motivated by something other than military calculation. Military logic is not the only logic that operates in wartime, and commanders make decisions for reasons that extend beyond pure strategic optimization. What the investigation claims is narrower. The pattern exists, it has no adequate explanation in strategic terms, and it concentrated the destruction on specific categories of target that shared the characteristic of being repositories of institutional knowledge and individual history. What that observation means about the person who directed it, the investigation presents without conclusion. It is evidence. It contributes to the shape of something the investigation is assembling without yet fully seeing. The question of who benefits from the gaps the bombardment created is the investigation's essential tool here. Several parties benefited from the destruction of the Dantooine archives in ways that are documentable. Malak himself, as the commander whose early history was most thoroughly housed in those archives, was among them. The investigation states this directly, because the evidence supports stating it directly, and because stating it directly is not the same thing as claiming it was the motivation. A person can benefit from an outcome without having pursued that outcome for the purpose of the benefit. The benefit and the motivation may be entirely separate. The Jedi Council, in a more complicated way, also benefited. The records that would have most thoroughly documented the Council's conduct during the revanchist period, the correspondence from the Dantooine end that would have preserved the local perspective on how the Council managed the developing situation, were among what burned. The Council's role in what Revan and Alec became is assessed, by subsequent historians, almost entirely on the basis of the Council's own communications. The perspective of the people most directly involved in their development is absent. What remains is the institutional record, which presents the institutional position in the best available institutional light. The investigation does not claim the Council destroyed its own records. It notes that someone else's destruction produced that outcome, and it notes the outcome because outcomes, in investigations of this kind, matter regardless of whether they were intended. The fragment that survived is the reason this chapter ends differently than it might have. An archivist named in the records only as Emsa Raz, a human woman, apparently, whose full name appears in one surviving document and not in the others, was stationed at the Dantooine Enclave in the period leading up to its destruction. She is not a prominent figure. She does not appear in any source concerned with the major events of this period. Her name would not be recoverable at all, except that she took a specific action in the weeks before the bombardment. She hid something, not the entire archive. That was not within the power of one person to accomplish before the attack reached Dantooine. A fragment, a specific collection of documents she had apparently judged, in her own assessment of the situation, important enough to move from the Enclave's main storage to a location outside its walls. The hiding place she chose was a storage structure in the agricultural settlement east of the Enclave complex, nondescript enough that it survived the bombardment's focus on the main facility, significant enough that its contents remained legible when they were eventually found. The fragment contains several items. The investigation has examined all of them. Most are what they appear to be, routine archival material that a careful archivist might prioritize for preservation simply on the grounds that it was old and fragile and likely to be lost in any disruption. One item is not routine. It is a transcript of a conversation between two Dantooine masters, recorded approximately 2 months before the bombardment, concerning the situation with Revan and Alec. The transcript is partial. Either the original was incomplete when archived, or some portion of it was damaged before the hiding. What survives covers a specific section of the conversation. What the masters were discussing, in the careful and indirect language that Jedi institutional conversation tends to favor, was a concern that neither of them had apparently raised through official channels. The concern was this, that Revan and Alec had not simply chosen a political position the Council disagreed with, or crossed an institutional line the Council needed to respond to. That what had happened to them, the war, the unknown regions, what they had brought back with them, had involved an influence that the Council's framing of the situation, as a policy disagreement, was entirely failing to address. One of the masters said, in the portion the investigation has access to, that she believed Revan had been trying to tell them something they had not been prepared to hear, that the return from the unknown regions had not been a turn toward darkness freely chosen, but a turn toward darkness that something else had initiated, and that the only person who might have been able to convey that accurately, who had been present for whatever had happened beyond the map, was the person the Council was now at war with. She was talking about Alec. The transcript ends there. The other master's response is in the missing portion. What the archivist Emiras thought she was preserving when she hid this fragment, the investigation cannot know. Whether she understood its significance or was simply being careful with everything old, the investigation cannot determine. What the fragment does is change the shape of what comes next. The investigation must now ask a question. It has been approaching from the edges since the first chapter. Not what Malak did, not what the dark side made him, but what Revan knew, and what Revan, in the time before Bastila's boarding team reached his ship, had been trying to do about it. The investigation has been building toward this chapter without knowing it. Every thread assembled so far, the training evaluations, the war, Malachor Vive, the unknown regions, Bastila's testimony, the shape of the destroyed archives, has been circling something that none of those threads named directly. The Dantooine fragment, introduced at the close of the previous chapter, is the document that finally makes that unnamed thing visible. But the fragment alone does not carry the full weight of what this chapter needs to examine. To understand what Revan knew and chose not to say, to understand why that silence matters more than almost anything else in this investigation, the Star Forge itself must first be understood, not as a weapon, not as a shipyard, as the thing the evidence indicates it actually was. The Rakata built the Star Forge approximately 25,000 years before the period this investigation concerns. The Rakata were not a civilization the galaxy remembers fondly, in the accounts that survive from the period of their dominance. They were conquerors, systematic, technologically sophisticated, operating through a force connection that their scholars characterized differently from the Jedi tradition, but that the evidence suggests drew on the same fundamental energy from a very different direction. Their empire, at its height, encompassed hundreds of worlds. Their technology was, by the standards of the Old Republic era, remarkable, and then they fell. The collapse of the Rakatan Infinite Empire is documented in their own surviving records, with a combination of technical detail and philosophical bewilderment that the investigation finds genuinely interesting. They knew what had happened to them. They could trace the mechanism, the spread of a plague that severed their connection to the Force, the collapse of a technological infrastructure that depended on Force use to function, the cascade of failures that followed. They documented all of it carefully. What they could not explain, even with that documentation, was why. Why the plague had come, where it had originated, whether it was a natural catastrophe, a consequence of how they had used the Force, or something else. The categories available to them could not accommodate. The Star Forge was the last significant artifact of their civilization. It orbited the Lehon system's star, drawing on that stellar energy directly, converting it through processes that combined Rakatan technology with dark-side Force manipulation into the capacity to produce warships and materiel at a rate that conventional manufacturing could not approach. The mechanism required the dark side to function, not as a fuel source in any simple sense. More precisely, the Star Forge's production capacity was directly proportional to the dark side energy channeled through it. The more darkness fed into it, the more it produced. The relationship ran in both directions. The Rakata had built a machine that both required and generated corruption. They had fed it, and it had fed them back. And the record of what that reciprocal relationship produced is what the Rakatan survivors were documenting with such careful bewilderment when their civilization finished collapsing. Revan found the Star Forge during the Unknown Regions expedition, based on the most plausible reconstruction the investigation can assemble from the surviving evidence. He recognized what it was. This is not speculation. The subsequent use of the Star Forge in the Jedi Civil War demonstrates a level of understanding of its capabilities that required genuine study of its nature. Revan knew the technology. He knew the history, or enough of it. He brought the Star Forge into the war as the engine that made the Sith fleet's production capabilities impossible for the Republic to match through conventional means. And then, at some point before Bastila Shan's boarding team reached his flagship at Lehon, he arrived at a conclusion that the Dantooine fragment's surviving masters appear to have been aware of. He intended to destroy it. The investigation presents this claim with the care it requires, because the primary source for it, the Dantooine fragment, is itself a partial transcript of a conversation between two masters, which is itself a record of information communicated to them by a source the transcript does not identify by name. The chain of transmission is long. The possibility of distortion at any point in that chain is real. What makes the claim credible, despite those transmission issues, is what it explains. The fragment alone does not establish intent, but the fragment combined with the behavioral evidence from the period before Revan's capture produces a pattern that is considerably harder to explain through any other reading. Revan's conduct in the final months before Bastila's mission reached him at Lehon shows, in the surviving military records of the Jedi Civil War, a set of decisions that historians have noted without fully explaining. He was pulling back. Not from the war continued at full intensity under his direction, but from specific types of engagement with the Star Forge itself. Command decisions that, earlier in the war, he had made directly and personally were being routed through intermediate commanders. His documented presence aboard the Star Forge decreases sharply in the records from that period, compared to the preceding years. He was maintaining strategic oversight of a war machine he was, by the evidence, increasingly avoiding direct contact with. The conventional reading of this pattern is that Revan was delegating as the war matured, that a competent commander naturally shifts from hands-on involvement to strategic oversight as operations become established enough to run without constant direct attention. The Dantooine fragment suggests a different reading, that he was not delegating because the operation was mature. He was creating distance because he had recognized what sustained proximity to the Star Forge was doing, not just to the war effort, not just to the Sith soldiers who operated within its influence, but to him personally, and to Malak. The distinction between how the Star Forge affected Revan and how it affected Malak is where the investigation's central relationship undergoes its most significant revision. Revan's capacity for strategic calculation, the quality that had distinguished him from the beginning, the thing Alec had found in him that his own urgency lacked, appears, based on the evidence, to have protected him in a specific way from the Star Forge's most thorough influence. Not because calculation is a defense against dark side corruption, but because Revan's relationship to the Star Forge was always instrumental. He used it. He thought about it. He assessed it. He maintained, throughout his use of it, a quality of analytical distance that prevented the reciprocal relationship the Rakata had fallen into from becoming total. He was being influenced. The evidence does not suggest he was immune, but the influence had not consumed the part of him that could recognize the influence as influence, and once he recognized it, he began the process of extracting himself from it. Malak's relationship to the Star Forge was different in a way that the investigation finds difficult to overstate. Where Revan used the Star Forge, Malak inhabited it. The records from the Jedi Civil War place him aboard it, or in its direct operational vicinity, with a consistency and duration that Revan's own presence does not match. He was there, continuously, commanding from within its influence, the way a person commands from within a space they have stopped experiencing as an external environment and started experiencing as an extension of themselves. The dark side energy the Star Forge generated and required, the reciprocal relationship between the machine's output and the darkness fed into it, had, by the evidence of this reading, found in Malak its most complete available instrument. He was not using the Star Forge. He had become its most thoroughly realized product. This is where the shape of the ambush at Lehon changes. The conventional account, the one that appears in every historical summary of the Jedi Civil War, the one that structures how this period is typically taught and remembered, presents the ambush as betrayal. A Sith apprentice, ambitious and opportunistic, recognized a moment where his master was vulnerable and acted to replace him. The motivation was power. The mechanism was treachery. The outcome was the consolidation of Sith command under a new leader who had proven his willingness to destroy anyone, including the person closest to him, in pursuit of dominance. This account fits the available evidence. It is not wrong, exactly, but the Dantooine fragment's information, combined with the pattern of Revan's withdrawal from the Star Forge and the evidence of Malak's total immersion in it, introduces a different geometry into the same event. If Revan intended to destroy the Star Forge, and if Malak had become, whether consciously or not, the person in whom the Star Forge's influence was most completely expressed, then the ambush takes on a dimension the betrayal narrative does not account for. Something moved against the person who intended to end it. The investigation does not claim the Star Forge possessed agency in the way a sentient being possesses agency. The evidence does not support that claim, and the investigation will not make it. What the evidence does support is a weaker but genuinely significant version of the same observation, that a dark side nexus of the Star Forge's documented nature, operating through the people most thoroughly under its influence, would produce behavior oriented toward its own continuation, not through deliberate planning, through the same mechanism the Rakata had experienced, the reciprocal relationship between the machine's needs and the actions of those who served it. Malak, from within that influence, turned against the one person who had both the will and the understanding to shut it down. Whether he knew this was what he was doing, the investigation cannot determine. The question is genuinely unanswerable, given the evidence available. What can be said is that the timing, the target, and the outcome align with a logic the betrayal narrative alone does not fully explain. Bastila Shan's boarding team reached Revan's flagship during the engagement at Lehon. What followed, the confrontation, the moments before Malak's order reached the gunners aboard his own vessel, is documented in multiple accounts that agree on the broad shape of events while diverging on specific details. Malak ordered his ship to fire on Revan's. The order was given knowing Bastila was aboard. The order was given knowing Revan was aboard. The order was designed to kill both, the Jedi Knight whose battle meditation the Republic depended on, and the Sith Lord whose vision had built the war machine that was destroying the Republic. The turbo lasers fired. What the investigation finds worth sitting with, in the accounts that reconstruct those specific moments, is the absence of hesitation in the record. Multiple sources that describe the order being given describe it as immediate. not agonized, not preceded by any documented pause that would suggest a person working through the weight of what they were deciding. The order came, and then the weapons fired, with a directness that the investigation cannot interpret with confidence. It could indicate that Malak had been working toward this moment for a long time, that the decision had already been made internally before the tactical situation made it executable. It could indicate that whatever process he might otherwise have used to weigh a decision of that magnitude had, through the Starforge's sustained influence, been simplified into something that operated closer to reflex than reasoning. It could indicate something else the investigation has not identified. Revan survived. Bastila survived. The ship did not fully destroy what it targeted, and the Jedi recovered Revan, and the decision was made, in the period that followed, to reconstruct him rather than interrogate him. His memories were taken. A new identity was layered over what had been there. The man who had known what the Starforge was, and what it was doing, and what needed to happen to it, was rebuilt into someone who did not know any of those things. The war continued. Under Malak, alone now, without the one person who had recognized the problem at the center of everything they had built, the war continued. The Starforge kept producing. The fleet kept growing. The dark side kept cycling through the reciprocal relationship the Rakata had documented so carefully before their civilization finished its collapse. And at the center of it, commanding from within an influence he apparently no longer experienced as external, was the man who had once been called Squint, who had once stood on a planet called Taris and been unable to look away from suffering, who had crossed every line because people were dying and no one was helping. Helping had become something the record could no longer find in him. The Starforge was still producing. The Force does not explain itself. This is not a philosophical position the investigation is taking. It is an observation about the documentary record, about what survives from the testimonies of Force-sensitive beings who lived through the period this investigation concerns, and later attempted to describe what they had sensed. Their accounts do not form a coherent explanation. They form something more like a collection of angles on a question that none of them, individually or together, could answer. What was the Force doing while Malak fell? The investigation has examined every available account from Force-sensitive witnesses of the Jedi Civil War period. What those accounts collectively produce is not clarity. It is a map of how many different things the Force can apparently be, or how many different things careful observers can perceive in it, when they are all looking at the same events from different positions. The map is the evidence. Master Vandar Tokare was, by the reckoning of most serious scholars of this period, among the most perceptive Force-sensitive beings the Jedi Order produced in the centuries surrounding the Mandalorian Wars. He was old, in a way that went beyond chronological age. His species' extended lifespan had given him exposure to multiple generations of Jedi, multiple cycles of the Order's institutional evolution, multiple crises that subsequent historians would treat as unprecedented, and that he had watched with the recognition of someone who had seen the shape before. He survived the Jedi Civil War. His accounts of the period exist in fragmentary but genuine form. What he described sensing, in the communications and personal records that survive from the war's duration, was not the war itself. This is the detail the investigation keeps returning to when it examines his testimony. A Force-sensitive being of Vandar's depth, present during a galaxy-spanning conflict of the Jedi Civil War's scale, might be expected to have his primary Force perceptions shaped by that conflict, by the deaths, the combat, the massive disruptions in the living Force that a war of that magnitude would produce. He described something older. The specific phrasing he used varies across different surviving documents. He was not writing a formal account, but recording impressions in the marginal notes and correspondence of an active institutional life. But a consistent image runs through all of it, the sense of something beneath the war, not hidden by it, beneath it, a disturbance whose origin preceded the conflict, and whose presence the conflict was, in some sense, expressing rather than causing. He did not name what that something was. The investigation cannot determine whether he knew and declined to commit it to record, or genuinely perceived the presence without identifying its source. The accounts do not say. They describe what he felt. in the careful language of a person who understood the difference between what could be verified and what could only be sensed. A wound, he called it, in the most direct surviving statement on this subject. Not a wound the war had made, a wound the war was flowing through. Jolee Bindo had a different relationship to institutional Jedi practice than Master Vandar, and a correspondingly different relationship to the question the investigation is examining. Bindo had spent decades in self-imposed isolation on Kashyyyk, following the events of his own complicated history with the dark side. A history this investigation does not have space to examine fully, but whose outline matters here. He had loved someone who turned to darkness. He had made a choice about how to respond to that turn that the Jedi Council had found inadequate. He had removed himself from the institutional conversation rather than continue having it. He was present for the events surrounding Revan's restoration in a way that placed him, briefly, within the same investigative frame as the central subjects of this account. What he said about the Force's role in what had happened to Revan and Malak was not what a more institutionally aligned Jedi would have said. He did not believe the Force had failed. He did not believe it had been absent. He believed it was operating according to a logic that beings of ordinary lifespan and ordinary experience were structurally ill-equipped to perceive from within. The Force, in his account, does not prevent falls, not because it lacks the capacity, and not because it is indifferent to the suffering falls produce, because the falls themselves are part of the pattern it is working through, because choices, including catastrophically bad choices, are not interruptions of the Force's movement, but expressions of it. The dark side was not something that happened to Malak against the Force's intentions. It was something the Force witnessed, as it witnesses everything, without the human category of prevention being applicable to how it operates. This position is uncomfortable, in a specific way the investigation wants to name directly. It does not comfort the people who suffered the consequences of Malak's choices. It does not reduce those consequences' weight. It simply locates them differently, not as evidence that the Force failed, but as evidence that the Force is operating on a scale at which individual falls, including those that produce galaxy-spanning wars, are not the primary unit of its attention. Bindo offered this, not as consolation, but as his honest assessment. The investigation presents it the same way. Mitra Surik's account, fragmentary, produced under circumstances that make its full reliability difficult to establish, adds a third angle to what Force-sensitive witnesses perceived during this period. She had cut herself off from the Force entirely following Malachor Feeve. Her perception of the Jedi Civil War's Force dimensions was therefore indirect, mediated through other people's accounts, through the residual sensitivity she carried, despite the severance, through the specific quality of awareness that people who have been deeply connected to the Force, and then separated from it, tend to retain at the edges. What she reported sensing, in the period when her connection was being restored, was a quality she described as wrongness that had no location, not associated with the Star Forge specifically, not associated with Malak specifically, not even associated with the war's military shape specifically, a pervasive quality in the Force of the era, as if something in the fundamental texture of Force experience in that period had been altered in a way that did not produce a single identifiable symptom, but expressed itself everywhere, slightly, simultaneously. The wound Master Vandar described from above, the pattern Jolee Bindo described from the philosophical remove of deliberate isolation, and Surik's account from the position of someone who had been too close to one of its sources and had been trying to exist at a distance from it ever since. None of them are describing the same thing in the same terms. All of them are pointing in the same direction. The question of prophecy presents the investigation with an unusual documentary situation. Prophecy and vision are, within the Force tradition, documented phenomena. The historical record contains numerous accounts of Force-sensitive beings receiving information about future events through mechanisms the tradition does not fully explain, but does consistently record. The Jedi archives, even in their post-Dantooine destruction state, contain substantial material on vision and foresight across many eras. For the period of the Jedi Civil War and the specific events surrounding Malak's fall, the investigation found something it did not expect. Almost nothing, not a total absence. The investigation will not overstate the gap. A few fragmentary references exist, in documents adjacent to the main archival record, to Jedi who reported visions during the war that they later associated with its events. But the volume of prophetic material is, compared to other crisis periods of similar magnitude in the Order's history, remarkably small. The investigation cannot determine what this means. Several explanations are available. The war may have disrupted the Force conditions under which such visions typically occur. The Dantooine destruction may have removed records the investigation cannot account for. The specific character of dark side activity in this period, the Starforger's influence, the Emperor's presence in the unknown regions, may have produced interference in the channels through which foresight typically operated. Or the events of this period may simply have been, for whatever reason, unusually difficult to see coming. The investigation presents each possibility without ranking them. The absence of prophetic documentation is evidence. What it is evidence of is not yet clear. The moment Malak died on the Starforge is documented in the military record as the end of the Jedi Civil War. The Starforge's destruction followed shortly after. The Sith fleet, deprived of both its command and its production capacity simultaneously, collapsed as a coherent military force. The Republic's victory was documented, processed, and entered into the official record with the administrative thoroughness that institutions apply to significant events when those events have resolved in the institution's favor. What the military record does not document is what Force-sensitive beings reported experiencing at the moment of Malak's death. Those accounts come from outside the official record, from personal correspondence, from the kind of informal testimony that circulates among people who share a common sensitivity and a common experience, without necessarily producing formal documentation. The investigation has assembled them from the scattered locations where they survive. The pattern they share is consistent enough to note, and strange enough to take seriously. They did not describe the death of a Sith Lord. The Force signature of a Sith Lord's death was not, in this period, an undocumented phenomenon. The war had produced others, and those accounts exist for comparison. What Force-sensitive witnesses described at the moment of Malak's death was not the distinctive disturbance that a powerful dark side being's departure from the living Force tends to produce. They described a silence, not the silence of something ending, the silence of something, and here the accounts diverge in their specific language while maintaining the same underlying image, being released. A tension that had been present so long it had become ambient, resolving, not dramatically, quietly, in a way that was only recognizable as resolution because of how different the Force felt in the moment after. Master Vandar's wound, draining slightly, not healing, draining. The investigation does not know what to do with this account except to record it. The image is consistent across independent witnesses. Its meaning is not. Whether what drained out of the Force at Malak's death was his specific darkness, or the Starforger's influence through him, or something that had entered both of them in the unknown regions and had been present in the Force of this era since, the accounts cannot say. They describe a sensation, not a cause. The investigation carries that sensation into what remains. The mystery still holds it. Whatever it was that eased when the Starforge burned and the man inside it died, it had been there. Witnesses felt it leave. What it was, and where it had come from, is a question the next 2 chapters will carry to the edge of what can be answered. The investigation has now assembled everything the surviving record contains. The training evaluations from Dantooine, the moral emergency of the Mandalorian Wars, Malachor Vive, and the specific quality of what that battle produced in the people who survived it. The unknown regions and the encounter the record cannot fully document. Bastila Shan's testimony, filtered through her proximity to a conversion attempt she nearly did not resist. The destroyed archives, and what their destruction obscured. The Starforge's nature, and what the Dantooine fragment suggests Revan understood about it. The Force testimony of 3 independent witnesses who described the same period from 3 irreconcilable angles. All of it is on the table. The question is what to do with it. 4 distinct interpretive traditions have formed around this evidence. 4 ways of organizing what the record preserves into a coherent account of how Alex Quinquagesimus became Darth Malak. Each tradition has serious scholarly support within the material available. Each fits a genuine portion of the evidence. Each produces a different person at the center of the same documented life. The investigation does not rank them. It presents each with the strongest case its own evidence supports, and then notes, carefully, what each one requires the investigator to set aside. The first theory, the loyal soldier who went too far. This is the oldest interpretation, and in certain respects, the most intuitively satisfying. It begins with what is most clearly documented about the person Alec was before the fall. His genuine idealism, his sincere conviction that the Jedi Council's passivity constituted a moral failure, his history of acting on that conviction at personal cost. Under this reading, Alec's trajectory follows a recognizable human pattern. A person with genuine values encounters an institution that fails to express those values adequately. They respond by finding a context, the Mandalorian Wars, where those values can be expressed directly, without institutional mediation. Within that context, sustained by the conviction that their cause is right, they do things that the original values would not have sanctioned, because the logic of the context keeps moving the boundary of what the cause requires. Each step feels like the previous step, only slightly further. There is never a moment where the person recognizes that they have crossed a line that cannot be recrossed. The evidence this theory handles best is the early record, the training evaluations, the Taris encounter, the documented frustration with the Council, the accounts of Alec's conduct in the early war years, the urgency, the leadership from the front, the treatment of soldiers as people rather than assets. Under this reading, all of that material is continuous with what came later. The Sith Lord is the same person as the Padawan, further along a path that began recognizably enough. It also handles the Bastila material reasonably well. A person who was originally motivated by genuine care for others retaining, even after significant corruption, the capacity for the kind of patient extended engagement the conversion attempt required. This is plausible under the loyal soldier reading. The care transformed, but did not entirely disappear. What this theory cannot absorb is the bombardment of Taris. The loyal soldier reading depends on the continuity between the original values and the later actions. The idea that even the darkest choices can be traced, however distantly, to the original conviction. But the man who stood on Taris as a Padawan and could not look away from the suffering of enslaved people, who found the gap between what was happening and what was being done about it morally unbearable, that man ordering turbo-laser strikes on the same planet's population is not a continuity the theory can explain. It can note the irony. It cannot account for it as an extension of the values it identifies at the trajectory's origin. The theory works until Taris, then it stops working. The second theory, the shadow who could not exist alone. This interpretation locates the essential problem not in Alec's values or their corruption, but in the structure of his identity, specifically in the degree to which that identity was organized around his relationship to Revan. Under this reading, Alec was never fully independent in the way the first theory assumes. His urgency was genuine, but it required Revan's strategic capacity to become effective. His conviction was real, but it found its fullest expression in complement to someone who thought in ways he did not. The combination was extraordinary. The components, in isolation, were each incomplete. The war had given that combination a purpose. The unknown regions had transformed it. But even transformed, even operating now under Sith designations and Sith methods, the fundamental structure remained. Malak as the force that moved, Revan as the intelligence that directed the movement. Remove Revan from that structure, and what remains is not an independent Sith Lord who happens to have lost his master. What remains is half of something that was never designed to operate as a whole. The evidence this theory handles most compellingly is the ambush at Lehon and what followed it. Malak's conduct as the sole commander of the Sith war machine shows, in the military record, a specific quality of strategic limitation that Revan's command had not exhibited. He was effective at direct application of overwhelming force. He was less effective at the kind of multivariable strategic patience that had made the Sith campaign so difficult for the Republic to counter in its early phases. The war under Malak's sole command was a different war, cruder, more dependent on material advantage, less characterized by the adaptive intelligence that had defined its earlier phases. The Bastilla project also fits this reading. What Malak was offering Bastilla, the experience of being completely seen, the relationship of mutual understanding across a shared force sensitivity, mirrors precisely what his relationship with Revan had provided. He was not simply attempting to acquire a useful asset. He was attempting to replace something structural. What this theory cannot absorb is the early record. The Alec documented before Revan's full influence, in the training evaluations, in the Taris encounter, in the revanchist period's earliest phase, is not a person defined by dependency. He arrived at his convictions independently. He acted on them before Revan gave him a framework for doing so effectively. The shadow theory requires a person who was never fully present in his own right, and the early record describes someone who was entirely present, uncomfortably, urgently, inescapably present. The theory works from Malachor Vive forward. Before that, it struggles to accommodate the person who existed. The third theory, the Star Forge's product. This interpretation shifts the causal weight away from Alec's psychology and toward the external influence the investigation spent Chapter 7 examining in detail. Under this reading, the question of what Malak chose is less important than the question of what chose through him. Specifically, the dark side nexus he inhabited so completely and for so long that the reciprocal relationship between its requirements and his behavior eventually became impossible to distinguish from his own will. The Rakata provides the template. An entire civilization, by their own documentation, was shaped by the Star Forge's reciprocal influence into something it had not been before the machine existed and would not have become without it. The corruption was not instantaneous. It accumulated across generations, expressing itself as the civilization's values shifted toward the things the Star Forge required to function optimally: conquest, subjugation, the cultivation of darkness in the populations under Rakatan control, because darkness fed the machine that fed the Empire. Malak's documented relationship with the Star Forge, the sustained proximity, the command presence aboard it, that exceeded Revan's by significant degree, makes him the closest available analog to the Rakata commanders who oversaw the machine at the height of their civilization's darkness. He was not simply using it, he was living inside it, and the Star Forge, by every account the investigation has access to, did not leave the people inside it unchanged. The theory's greatest strength is precisely what makes it most uncomfortable. It is the reading that most thoroughly removes Malak's agency from the account. If the Star Forge shaped him, if what he became was the machine's product rather than his choice, then the moral calculus of his actions becomes considerably more difficult to apply in conventional terms. The bombardments, the conversion attempts, the ambush, all of them take on a different quality if the entity executing them was, at some fundamental level, an instrument rather than an author. What this theory cannot absorb is Bastilla's testimony about the patient, careful, genuinely engaged quality of the conversion attempt. Instruments do not negotiate. They do not listen carefully to counter-arguments and respond to their specific content. They do not seek understanding in another person. The Malak Bastilla described was not operating like a machine, expressing its programming. He was operating like a person, pursuing something he genuinely wanted. The Star Forge theory explains the cruelty. It cannot explain the care. The fourth theory, the choice was always there. This is the most demanding interpretation to present fairly, because it is the one that places the weight of everything that happened most directly on Malak himself, and doing so risks producing an account that feels punitive rather than analytical. The theory holds that at every significant juncture in the documented record, Alec made a choice. He chose to follow Revan into the war, rather than continue arguing within the Order's structures. He chose to accept the Sith designation that followed the unknown regions. He chose to remain aboard the Starforge when Revan began creating distance from it. He chose to give the order at Lehon. He chose to pursue the conversion of Bastila rather than eliminate her as a military threat. He chose, at every point where the record shows him acting, to act in the direction he acted. The Force tradition the investigation has been working within throughout this account holds, through multiple independent sources, that the dark side does not compel. It influences. It amplifies. It makes certain choices feel easier and others feel harder, but it does not remove the chooser from the choice. Master Vandar's accounts, Jolie Bindo's accounts, the broader Jedi philosophical tradition regarding the relationship between individuals and the Force, all of them maintain this distinction, carefully, because they understand what is lost if the distinction collapses. The evidence this theory handles with the most precision is Malak's final conversation, which the investigation will examine in detail in the chapter that follows. Because what Malak says at the end, the specific quality of reflection, the direct engagement with the question of what he had done and why, is not the language of someone who believes themselves to have been swept along by forces beyond their control. He speaks as a person who made decisions and is accounting for them. The accountability itself is a form of evidence. What the fourth theory cannot absorb comfortably is the unknown region's material. The encounter with whatever vitiate was, an intelligence of that age and that specific capacity for shaping other minds, operating on a person who arrived in those regions already carrying Malachor Viv's damage and the accumulated weight of years of war. The theory's insistence on uncompromised choice strains against the evidence of what that combination could plausibly have produced. Choice requires a chooser who is intact enough to choose. The question of how intact Alec was, at each juncture the theory points to, is not one the fourth reading fully addresses. The four theories are now laid out. The evidence each absorbs, and each cannot absorb, is part of the record. The investigation has been sitting with all four simultaneously throughout the preparation of this account, and what emerges from that sustained simultaneity is not a fifth theory. It is an observation about the shape of the four that already exist. Each theory identifies something real. The loyal soldier reading captures something genuine about the origin, the idealism, the continuity of concern, the recognizable human pattern of values, surviving their own expression in degraded form. The shadow reading captures something genuine about the relationship, the structural dependency, the incompleteness of each person without the other, the quality of what Lehon destroyed that was not simply a master-apprentice hierarchy. The Starforge reading captures something genuine about the influence, the documented properties of the Nexus, the Rakata precedent, the behavioral evidence of what sustained proximity to that kind of dark side concentration produces. The fourth reading captures something genuine about the person, the capacity for reflection, the evidence of ongoing decision-making, the final conversation's quality of accountability. None of them is wrong. None of them is complete. Each illuminates a portion of the available evidence by casting shadow on another portion. The investigation has come to understand this, not as a failure of the evidence or a failure of the theories, but as an accurate reflection of how a human being, even a very thoroughly documented one, resists the kind of reduction that theories require. Malak was a person. Persons contain more than any framework designed to explain them can hold. What the four theories share, underneath their differences, is the same unanswered question. Each of them explains what he did. None of them explains what he wanted. Not power. The evidence from Bastila's testimony suggests something more specific than the general category of power, something that power turned out not to be a substitute for, not victory. The war he was winning was, by the record, not producing whatever it was the winning was supposed to produce. Not even the destruction of the Jedi Order, which he was accomplishing methodically, and which the record does not show bringing him any discernible satisfaction. At the deepest level, the investigation can reach beneath the documented actions, beneath the strategic decisions, and the bombardments, and the conversion attempt, and the order at Lehon. What was Malak trying to build? The record has one more place to look. The Temple of the Ancients. The final conversation. The minutes before the end, when there was nothing left to pursue or protect or destroy. And two people, who had once been Squint and the Revanchist, stood across from each other, with all of it behind them. Whatever Malak wanted, if he knew it by then, he said it there. The Temple of the Ancients stands on Rakata Prime, as if the planet built it to outlast everything else. The Rakata constructed it in an era so distant that the Republic historians who catalogued it could not agree on the dating within a margin of several thousand years. It had housed artifacts, records, and a dark side presence that the Rakata had cultivated with the same methodical attention they brought to everything. Systematically, without sentiment, in service of a power they believed they understood and did not. By the time the events this chapter concerns occurred, the temple was old in a way that made the Jedi Civil War feel recent. It had seen the Rakata rise and fall. It had seen the Starforge built and forgotten and rediscovered. It had absorbed centuries of dark side energy with the patience of stone, neither amplifying nor releasing it, simply holding it the way ancient structures hold the weight of everything that happened inside them. The final confrontation between the restored Revan and Darth Malak took place within it. The military record marks this engagement as the decisive moment of the Jedi Civil War's conclusion. The death of the Sith commander, the subsequent destruction of the Starforge, the collapse of the fleet that had no remaining command or production capacity to sustain itself. The record handles it efficiently, in the way military records handle decisive moments, moving quickly from the event to its consequences. What the military record does not preserve is the conversation. The restored Revan was not, by the time he reached that confrontation, the person who had ordered the Starforge's construction or commanded the Sith fleet in the war's opening campaigns. The Jedi Council's decision to rebuild his identity rather than restore it had produced someone who carried Revan's force ability and Revan's strategic capacity while lacking Revan's memories of how those qualities had previously been applied. He had been, in the period following his restoration, reassembling an understanding of who he had been from fragments, testimony from people who had known him, records that survived the war's archival destruction, the gradual return of sensations and impressions that the memory wipe had not entirely eliminated. He arrived at the Temple of the Ancients, knowing more than the Jedi Council had perhaps intended him to know by that point, and less than the full picture would have required. Malak knew who he was facing. The records from Sith intelligence during the period between Revan's capture and this confrontation document, Malak's awareness of the restoration project, with a specificity that suggests he had been tracking it carefully. He knew that the person the Republic had rebuilt from Revan's remnants was now moving toward him. He knew, with the force sensitivity that had always been among his most significant capabilities, that the approach was real and that what was approaching had Revan's quality in the force, even if it did not have Revan's complete self. The investigation cannot know what Malak felt in the period before that confrontation. The record does not preserve his internal experience of the days and hours leading to it. What the record preserves is the fight, documented in subsequent accounts from Revan himself and from others who reconstructed it from available evidence, and what came after the fight. The fight ended. Malak was wounded beyond recovery, and the conversation that followed is the final document this investigation has to work with. He did not, according to the accounts that reconstruct the dialogue, begin with recrimination. The investigation finds this detail worth dwelling on, because it was not the response the situation's dramatic logic would have predicted. A Sith Lord mortally wounded by the person whose death he had ordered, whose position he had taken, whose identity the enemy had rebuilt and aimed back at him like a weapon. The expected response is rage, or denial, or the kind of final defiance that the dark side tradition tends to favor as its closing statement. He reflected instead. The specific quality of what he said, reconstructed from Revan's own later account, and from the accounts of others who had access to Revan's testimony, is the closest the investigation comes to the interior of the person this entire account has been trying to understand. And what it finds there is not what any of the four theories, individually, would have predicted. He asked about choices, not in the abstract, philosophical way the question might be raised in a scholarly context. He asked it personally, about his own choices, about Revan's choices, about whether the distinction between them that the war had produced was as fundamental as the war had made it appear. He had spent years building an identity around that distinction. Darth Malak, the one who had surpassed his master, the one who had recognized what decisiveness required when his master had hesitated. In the Temple of the Ancients, with that identity no longer operative in any practical sense, he examined the distinction and found it complicated in ways he had not been prepared to find it. Revan, he said, in the reconstruction the investigation has access to, had always known something he had not. This was not, by the tone of the accounts, an admission of inferiority in the hierarchy the Sith tradition used to organize relationships. It was something more specific. Revan had known when to stop, had recognized the Starforge for what it was, and begun, quietly, to extract himself from it, had carried the war forward while simultaneously holding a private intention to end the thing driving it. That capacity, to inhabit a situation completely while maintaining the internal clarity to see past it, was, Malak acknowledged, something he had not possessed. He did not, the accounts are careful to note, present this as exculpation. He was not arguing that the absence of that capacity absolved him of the choices the investigation's fourth theory locates at the center of his account. He was describing what he saw when he looked at the record honestly, in the minutes, when honesty had nothing left to cost. What he said about the specific acts the investigation has been examining across these chapters is partial, filtered through reconstruction, and impossible to verify against a primary source. The investigation presents it with that limitation clearly named. On the bombardments, on Taris, on Dantooine, on the pattern of destruction the suppression chapter examined, he said, in the reconstruction, that he had understood what he was doing. Not that the understanding had stopped him, that he had possessed it. The awareness that each bombardment was irreversible, that the people below were people, that the man he had been would not have recognized the man giving those orders. He had held all of that, apparently, while giving the orders anyway, not from cruelty in the sense the word typically carries, from a conviction, by that point fully formed, that the galaxy required what he was building, more than it required the things he was destroying to build it. The investigation notes this without comment, because the commentary the statement invites is not the investigation's to offer. On Bastila, on the weeks of patient, careful, deeply attentive effort to bring her across the line he had crossed, he was less direct in the reconstruction. What the accounts preserve is something more oblique. He had wanted, he said, to show someone. He had wanted someone else to see what he saw from where he was standing, to confirm that where he was standing was real, that the view from there was the view he believed it was. Bastila had been, in his assessment, the most likely available person to be capable of that confirmation. She had not confirmed it. She had stood at the edge and pulled back, and what that had told him, which he did not say directly in the reconstruction, but which the investigation reads in the silence around what he did say, was something he had apparently not been fully prepared to hear, that the view from where he was standing might not be what he believed it was. That confirmation of a kind he could have trusted had not arrived. On Revan, the word that Bastila had preserved, the one who understood. The reconstruction contains only one reference. He said that he had not known, when he gave the order at Lehon, what the silence would feel like. He had known Revan would be gone. He had not, apparently, fully anticipated what it meant to be the person who remained, after the only understanding available had been removed. Whether this constitutes regret, in the form the word typically carries, the investigation genuinely cannot determine. The accounts do not preserve the tone, they preserve the content, and the content is not the same thing as the emotional weight behind it. The investigation wants to spend a moment with the question of what was left in him when he said all of this. The young man the training evaluation had called uncorrectable, the one who cared too much to be neutral, had, by the evidence of this final conversation, not entirely disappeared. What the war and the unknown regions and the Starforge and the years of command had done to him was extensive and documented. But the capacity for honest self-examination that emerges in those final minutes is not the capacity of someone who had become fully what the dark side typically produces. Fully realized darkness, in the tradition the Jedi records describe, does not tend to produce the kind of reflection the Temple of the Ancients conversation preserved. Something remained. The investigation cannot identify it with precision, cannot locate it within any of the four theories as a clean confirmation of one over the others. The loyal soldier theory would call it the original idealism, persisting past everything done to extinguish it. The shadow theory would call it the space left by Revan's absence, finally speaking honestly, because the performance of Sith Lordship had no remaining audience. The Starforge theory would note that he was dying, and the Starforge's influence was ending with the life that had hosted it. The fourth theory would call it choice, the same capacity for choice that had been present throughout, now directing itself toward honesty, because nothing remained that dishonesty could protect. All four readings fit the final conversation. None of them fits it exclusively. The mystery, even at its endpoint, does not resolve into a single answer. Revan, by the accounts of those who spoke with him in the period following this confrontation, did not describe what happened in the Temple of the Ancients in terms that suggested closure. He described it in terms that suggested weight. Something had been added to what he carried, not subtracted. The death of the person who had been closest to him, the person who had ordered his death, who had been built in his own shadow, and destroyed the source of that shadow, and spent years discovering what it meant to exist, in the absence of what had cast it, was not an event that produced clean resolution in the man who had survived it. The investigation does not interpret this to mean Revan pitied Malak, or forgave him in any formal sense, or concluded that what Malak had done was less than what it was. The accounts do not support any of those conclusions. It interprets it to mean that the final conversation had added something to the record of what Malak was, that the record of what Malak had done did not contain. The man who died in the Temple of the Ancients was not simple, not entirely. The investigation has known this since Chapter 1, since the name Squint appeared in the margin of an archival document written by someone who wanted future readers to understand that even the length of who he was had been abbreviated by the people around him. It has been measuring the distance between that margin note and this temple ever since. The distance is real. The investigation has documented it carefully, across 10 chapters, and every piece of evidence the surviving record makes available. The distance is also, and this is the part the investigation has been moving toward, without knowing how to say directly until now, not infinite. The person at one end of it and the person at the other end of it are connected by a thread the investigation can trace, even when it cannot explain. The boy who could not look away from suffering became the man who produced it at scale. The thread between them runs through everything the investigation has examined. It has not broken, because threads of this kind do not break. They transform into something the original thread would not recognize, but they remain, and you can follow them backward from the end to the beginning, if you are willing to look at what the following reveals. The question the investigation opened with is still here. How does a person become the thing they most despise? It has been present in every chapter, carried forward by each new piece of evidence, never answered in the way the question's grammar seems to invite, with a single cause, a decisive moment, a clear point of no return that explains everything before and after it. The record does not contain that answer. The investigation has examined everything the record contains, and the clean answer is not among it. What is among it is something the investigation has come to find more honest and more durable than a clean answer would have been. The process was real. It was gradual. It involved genuine conviction in its early stages, genuine damage in its middle stages, and genuine loss in its final stages. The loss of the understanding that Bastila's testimony names, the loss of the capacity the Dantooine fragment's masters described Revan as having possessed, and Malak as having lacked, the loss of whatever it was that the Force-sensitive witnesses felt ease when the Starforge burned. None of the four theories captures all of that. Together, imperfectly, incompletely, each covering what the others cannot reach. They map it. The map is not the territory. The territory was a person, and the person is gone, and what remains is the documentation. The fragments the archivist M. Eras hid in an agricultural outbuilding east of a Jedi enclave that no longer exists. The margin note that wrote squint beside a name too long to carry. The reconstruction of a final conversation in a temple older than the civilization that produced the man who died in it. These things are what the investigation has. They are not enough to answer the question. They are enough to understand why the question has no answer. Somewhere in the oldest surviving records of the Jedi Order, in the margins of documents concerned with other subjects, the question is still there, written in no formal language, carried by no official archive, preserved the way the most durable questions are preserved, not in institutions, but in the silence that forms around something the record could not explain and did not know how to forget. How does a person become the thing they most despise? The record says, gradually. The record says, through genuine conviction, at first. The record says, through exposure to things that the person's genuine conviction had no preparation for. The record says, the question survives the person. It always has.